Click the subscribe button above so you don't miss a single wild Western action adventure. Chapter 1. At the farthest outpost of civilization, on the edge of the Colorado River Badlands, with her scattered stores and dwellings in a gray mantle of dust and haze. It was August, and the cottonwood and shake trees along the streets seemed to droop their shoulders of leaf and bough beneath the weight of merciless heat beating down from a fever-red sun. To the west, distorted figures of mirage did a weird, slow sword dance among the jagged, dagger-like spires of the Vermilion cliffs. On the south, monstrous thunderheads were piling up, blue-black at their bloated bases, creamy white on their sunlit summits. Red shuttles of electricity passed between these clouds, and low growls of thunder came from the dark canyons beneath. In the adobe courthouse, at the center of the village, was congregated a group of the district's most prominent citizens. They were all in shirt sleeves, and every one of them was tremendously interested. Oratory was the order of the day, and it was this that held the breathless attention of the young man in the adjoining room. "I'm telling you, men," Oliver, the sheepman who held the floor at that particular moment, was proclaiming, "this Stafford feller is plain no good. Stafford, a forlorn, some call him. Others just plain shiftless Stafford. Spends 2/3 of his time prowling round down in the forlorn country. Doing what? We ought to take him out of the sheriff's keeping and make an example of him." "Well, Oliver," put in Ross, who could be identified as sheriff by his star, "you'll have to admit that he couldn't get into mischief down there." "There ain't nothing to get into mischief with." Oliver, a tall, florid-faced man with a close-cropped mustache which bristled like an awning over a savage mouth, sniffed. "There's a lot nobody knows about that country down there. Besides, how do we know how much of his time has been spent down there? Maybe it's a blind for skullduggery all the time. Anyhow, we've got the goods on him this trip. Old Ben here was beat almost to death, left to die in fact. Ben will describe the party for you. Describe him so that anybody can tell it's Stafford. Are we going to stand for it? We are not. Sheriff, you questioned this feller Stafford about his business at the time, and what did he tell you?" "Told me he hadn't got in from the forlorn when this happened," answered Sheriff Ross thoughtfully, "and from the looks of him he might just as well have come off a griddle. And that's what the forlorn country is these days." Oliver's answering laugh rang sneeringly through the room. Some alibi, some alibi. He hadn't got in from the forlorn. "What's he doing down in the forlorn?" the sheepman shouted. "And can he prove that he was there? He beat up old Ben here, didn't he, Ben?" The old goatish-looking man felt his bruised body and muttered, "Yep, someone did sure enough, but I ain't sure." "But you said it looked just like him, didn't you?" shouted Oliver. Old Ben winced as though he had been hit. "Yep, he sure enough did," he bleated, but his face was partly covered. "Right down to his make of boots, and the color of his hair, he looked like him, didn't he?" interrupted Oliver. "Yep, he sure enough did," affirmed old Ben, staring at the sheepman as though hypnotized. "There ain't no doubt in the world but that he done it. How about it, men? Do you agree with Ben?" asked Oliver. A vociferous approval of the speaker's statements followed. Apparently, about 7/8 of the gathering were prejudiced against Stafford of Forlorn. The man in the small room was perfectly cognizant of this attitude, for he squirmed industriously to finish untying himself. He succeeded in freeing his arms in another minute, and bending quickly, extricated his legs. Standing erect, he strode to the window of his cell, for that was what the room was, and looked out. Several good-looking horses stood at the hitching posts. One of them, an especially fine-looking sorrel, had an S.O. on its flank. The brand placed it as Oliver's, and next to it were a pair of pack horses with well-filled packs upon their backs. These horses also had the Oliver brand, and the young man in the cell looked at them with keenest interest. Back in the main room of the courthouse, oratory was still rampant. The citizens were now intent upon the kind and measure of justice to be meted out to the undesirable gentleman from the forlorn country. Stafford smiled broadly, and striding across the room, he grabbed up an old table standing in the corner, and with a quick flip turned it over. Then, while the declaiming in the courtroom was at its height, he placed his foot against one leg of the table and pushed, holding the table flat as he did so. The results were gratifying from two standpoints. The leg pried off easily and without much sound. In comparison with the din in the other room, the job was noiseless. Picking up his table leg, Stafford strode to the window, and inserting it between the bars, he began the work of wrecking them. There was little danger of being disturbed at this task, for the window he chose faced the blank end of a large barn. Rush was more than democratic in allowing its citizens to erect hay barns, pig pens, corrals, and what not within its limits. The opening made, Stafford crawled through the aperture and stretched luxuriously in the sunlight. In this seemingly bold maneuver, there was not any great element of risk, for the young man from the forlorn country knew that every citizen of Rush not at the courthouse was asleep. It would not be sensible for anyone to be otherwise. In addition to this fact, not many of the people knew him well. Out there in the sunlight, he would pass for anyone but himself, unless the observer came close and knew him. The windows were too high for those within to notice him. Grinning appreciatively at the continued din, Stafford opened his pocket-knife and moved from horse to horse, stopping at each one long enough to neatly cut through the cinches. When he had finished this, the excitement still ran high inside. Apparently, the town was planning to make a gala affair of his chastisement. "When you're riding luck, you want to stay in the saddle," he mused, and widened his activities by untying some of the horses at the front of the courthouse and replacing them with the two pack animals and the saddle horse belonging to Oliver, the only 3 horses whose cinches remained intact. They would be much handier to take here at the door. As he finished with this task, he heard a little gasp, and turning around found a slim, almost frail-looking youth surveying him from beneath the brim of a slouch hat. Stafford felt his first twinge of uneasiness at the sight. If the boy yelled, he could jump into the saddle and run. But that was not the way he had planned the affair, and he was a stickler for having things work according to plan. "Hello, buddy," he greeted the newcomer casually. "Howdy, mister," came the answer in a small, grave voice, while Stafford could feel a pair of keen, intelligent eyes probing him from beneath the drooping hat brim. Suddenly, Stafford was consumed with a desire to see the face and determine how much suspicion it contained. He took a step forward, and the youth immediately darted back too. "That's no way to do when a fellow tries to be friendly," Stafford said reprovingly. "Shove your hat back so I can see your face." "I won't," came the positive answer. "The sunlight hurts my eyes, and besides, perhaps I don't want to be friendly." "How long have you been around here?" demanded Stafford. "Quite a while." Perplexity puckered the corners of Stafford's eyes, while a wry smile twisted his humorous mouth. You saw me inspecting the horses then?" "Yes." And you didn't happen to see me come out of the front door, did you?" "No, but I saw you come through the back window. You're strong, aren't you?" "I'm more startled, floundered, and perplexed than anything else." "Where were you?" "Sitting on the shady side of the courthouse, listening to the talking. Then I heard what was going on at the back, and went around to see. I kept behind a cottonwood, though." "You oughtn't to listen to men talking the way those were," Stafford reproved again. "It's apt to have a hardening effect on your young sensibilities." "But why didn't you yell and give the alarm?" The youth continued to appraise him disconcertingly from the shelter of his broad-brimmed hat. Moreover, he always stood in the shade, which made the shadows deeper. "Perhaps I shall yet," he stated defiantly. "You'd better not," warned Stafford. "Why?" "You'd be spanked for not howling sooner." Maybe, said the youth doubtfully. What's your given name? Chad. I supposed everyone around here knew it by now since I got notorious. Chad, repeated the youth in a musical tone. That's a nice name. Take off your hat and let me see your hair. Aghast, Stafford complied. There was really no need for haste. The argument within still raged. Oh, exclaimed the boy in an ecstatic voice, it's brown and curly. You're one weird kid, responded Stafford. Why aren't you looking to see if I've got guns and how many notches there are in them? That would be a more normal way for a kid to act. Why, you're not armed, are you? Exclaimed the boy. No, I'm not, frowned Stafford. And I'm worried about you worse than you could possibly be about me. A kid that talks like you do is growing up unnatural. If you don't get over that sissified way of speaking, you'll get spindle-legged, weak-eyed, and bald-headed young. Smarty, came the answer. You're cheeky, breaking jail and then starting in to reform me. Talk grown up, don't you? Observed Stafford. You're one of these kids that's kept off in the bushes most of the time, with just old folks around, I'm afraid. Make them take you to town oftener, and get in with some tough kids that will maybe black your eyes and teach you to say ain't and talk like a man. Oh, gasped the youth. You shouldn't gasp, reproved Stafford, scowling. Now, scoot over behind that tree and watch me get some guns. If you keep still, you'll have lots of fun. If you make a noise, Stafford's scowl became more fierce than one would have thought possible. Well, if you make a noise, it will be just too bad. And don't try to cross the street. I've got eyes in the back of my head. I could see you even if I was inside, and I'd get you before you got anywhere. I won't run, and I won't tell. Something in the boy's tone brought Stafford up short after taking a step toward the door. Were you laughing? He asked severely. No, but I won't tell. Go on, hurried the youth. You ought to get on one of those horses. I will in just a second, promised Stafford and ran up the stairs. At the top, he knocked. Old Bill Geggus, self-appointed bailiff of the Rush Court, would surely be at the door with his heavy 6 guns strapped about his waist. At the second knock, the door opened a crack. Stafford wanted more than cracks, however, and stepped discreetly behind it. The door opened farther, and half of Geggus' burly form appeared. On that half was one of his 6 guns. Stafford's hand flew out like a flash of light, and Geggus' mouth sagged open as the muzzle of his own weapon poked at his stomach a fractional second later. The smile in Stafford's eyes was grim, as he grasped Geggus' whiskers with his other hand and pulled him none too gently through the door, which he closed behind him with his foot. Immediately, the Rush bailiff lost his second weapon, lost it long before the dumb astonishment had faded from his face. Now, you old walrus, whispered Stafford fiercely, you can escort me into this august assembly, only it won't be just like you've dreamed of doing it. I'll walk behind you and use that double-duty stomach of yours as a lead screen in case any of the citizens get excited and start shooting. From within came the sheriff's voice in a grieved sing-song. Well, men, if you're all against me, I reckon I can't hold out alone against all the citizens of this county, though I warn you, it's against the law. That's the talk, shouted Oliver. I knew you'd come to it. Boys, we'll have that young rooster out of his coop and a good coat of tar and feathers on for a starter. Go get him, some of you. I'm already here, Oliver, came the crisp answer from behind, and the mob turned to face a pair of unwavering gun barrels backed by Chad Stafford's bleak blue eyes. A hush fell over the assembly. Gentlemen, began Stafford, I guess it's about my turn to orate. Keep your hands away from your hips while I'm doing it. Did anyone ask what was taken from this old Ben that bleats when Oliver cracks the whip? What was I supposed to have taken? He never took anything, exclaimed Oliver furiously, because we came along and scared him away before he had a chance. Something was too took, trebled old Ben, but his voice went unheard. Shut up, Stafford snapped at Oliver, or if you've got to talk, talk low. The fact of the matter is that you, all of you, know down in your hearts that old Ben didn't have anything that I wanted. He's poor, downright poor, and no one accused him of having a sock of gold hid, like we hear about so frequent. Moreover, you know that I'm not the sort of man that's craving a lot of cash for spending. What would be my incentive? You've been accusing me of other things too, and getting 2 or 3 people in each case to swear they had seen me or had evidence that I was there, when actually I was in the desert. Now, the only man in this room that dislikes me well enough to go to all this trouble is Sam Oliver. Just what is Sam's reason for hating me so much, I'm not sure, except perhaps it's because he knows I think he's a four-flusher, and I've never hesitated to tell him to keep his nose out of my business. Oliver always has had a lot of curiosity about my wandering around down in the forlorn country, but he hasn't got any satisfaction out of it, except the one of hanging the moniker of shiftless Stafford on me. But now he's let his hate run away with his brains enough to try getting me out of the country by the split-rail method, or worse. He ought to be smart enough to know I wouldn't stand for that. If the sheriff feels that it's up to him to put me in the calaboose for a time, just by way of showing his authority, why, I'm not the one to object. But when he goes to wearing a hypocrite's long face and siding with Oliver on anything as radical as this, I feel compelled to stand up for my rights. Sheriff Ross swelled with outraged dignity. I was trying to protect you, Stafford, but you can see how it is. Your black record has turned the whole county against you. My black record consists in minding my own business, not snooping into other people's affairs, and expecting other people to do the same, flashed Stafford. And this is what I get. You're not altogether right on that, cut in the sheriff again. A lot of people who are good, respectable people have identified you as being mixed up in a lot of mischief around these parts. How do you account for that? Only, retorted Stafford bitterly, by saying that the whole town is under the thumb of Sam Oliver here, and they lie when he says to, the sheriff included. As he made the statements, Stafford realized that he did not altogether believe it himself, the part about lying at least, but he went on defiantly. So long as you people have given me the name, I'll take the game. I'm leaving for the forlorn country now, and I'm riding astride Sam Oliver's favorite horse. I'm also taking along 2 of his pack animals with provisions, which I intend to use. This, Oliver, will give you and Ross all the excuse in the world for looking me up, and I'll be home to receive callers any time after Thursday. Just remember the address, Shiftless Stafford of Forlorn. Chapter 2. Stepping quickly out of the room, Stafford slammed the door shut and locked it with the key he had taken from Gegas. Running down the steps, he flung himself on Oliver's sorrel, and turning loose the 2 pack animals, he hazed them down the street at a wild gallop. Before they had run a block, the 2 pack animals were thoroughly imbued with the spirit of the occasion, and ran with a fleetness that was truly surprising. Best of all, Stafford knew that for the first 2 miles or better, he would have no trouble in keeping them headed right. As for that distance, the route he wished to take them over was the one used by Oliver's men. With the advantage thus given him, Stafford twisted in his saddle to see by the time he had gone 2 blocks men were bolting from the doors and windows of the courthouse. It was a frantically excited crowd, and wildest among them would be Oliver and Ross. Shots were fired at the fugitive by such of the men as were without mounts, but these went far wild, and Stafford watched with keen interest while the others ran for their horses. Some of the girths broke, spilling their owners upon the ground before they had ever touched the saddle seat. Others, with a trifle more of the leather hanging, held till the horses had taken a couple of leaps. Then, by 1s and 2s, the riders left their horses, tumbling to the road in ignominious heaps. At the sight, Stafford stood up in his saddle and let out a defiant whoop. Then, just before he reached the turn in the street, he saw the slim, denim-clad figure of a boy watching from beside the trunk of a giant cottonwood. The youth was standing on his tiptoes, waving something white and Stafford whirled his hat in answer. Luck was with him, and 10 minutes later he was hazing the pack horses into a wilderness of squaw brush, wild hawthorn, and cedar which choked the entrance to a dry canyon. The trail to Oliver's ranch lay behind now. Ahead was the wilderness. That, and the canyon-bounded, heat-blasted barrenness of the forlorn land. As he rode, Stafford felt a weird mingling of exultation that he had defied the people who had prepared to humiliate and torture him, and wonder that he had done so madly impulsive a thing. He had dared them to invade his sanctuary, and now that the invitation had been given, he was prepared to make the trip a highly educational one for those who chose to take it. Stafford a forlorn. He had won that title by years of roaming in this practically unexplored, canyon-crossed, mesa-studded wilderness. Much that he had learned of the region was unknown to any other living man. Yet there were still things down here to be solved, one thing in particular that made his blood sing with the same wild music of adventure that had sent the mail-clad Spanish explorers clambering over unnamed mountains and wading through chartless jungles in centuries past. Involuntarily, he reached into his inner vest pocket to see if the precious piece of leather was still there. It was, and with relief, Stafford thought of the events of the past day. Strange about that boy. One would naturally have expected him to give the alarm, unless he was really frightened by Stafford's threat. Somehow, Chad doubted that. He had not seemed particularly afraid. He hoped that someday he would meet the boy again, and have a chance to show his gratitude. As he speculated, the going grew still rougher, until he was compelled to go ahead and lead the way for the pack animals. He was delighted to find that they were trained and willing to follow. The clouds to the southward mounted higher until the sky was overcast. Soon, great drops spattered upon the rocks and made music among the leaves. For the first time, Stafford looked to see if there was a slicker tied behind the saddle. There was one, and donning it, he rode on through the lightning-ruptured murk, thankful for the increasing violence of the storm. All the remainder of that day, and far into the night he traveled, marking his course by the lightning flashes that accompanied each successive squall. Then, when the storm settled into a steady, pitch-black downpour, he stopped in a little clump of cedar along the side of a narrow canyon and waited for daybreak. Light came without any slackening of the deluge, and he was forced several times during the day to rechart his course to avoid stream beds made impassable by the sudden advent of floodwater. That afternoon, tired and water-soaked, he crossed a naked rock plateau littered with fallen spires of rock gnawed from their pedestals by the sharp teeth of erosion. Dropping from this barren plain, he made his way through the drenching twilight to a tiny cave above a sage and cedar-covered flat. Getting stiffly from his horse, he made his way to the cave mouth, the slicker rattling about his legs as he walked. Close to the mouth, he paused and peered within, flashing his electric torch about the dark interior. It was one of the hidden spots that went to constitute his home in the forlorn country. Yet, coming to it after a prolonged absence, he felt the same trepidation that a wild animal does about entering its burrow. Danger might be within. Satisfied that the place was empty, Stafford strode inside and looked about. Nothing, so far as he could see, had been touched. Accordingly, he kindled a fire in a natural fireplace where the smoke sucked up through a crevice in the rocks. With the fire going, he went outside again, and taking the packs from the horses, he carried the dunnage inside and put the animals on picket ropes. With dawn, he intended to be away on the business that had held him all these past years. Before then, there was much to be done, packs to be sorted, and a route laid that would defy men who might follow him. It was not until he started to rummage in the rude cupboard, built into the wall of the cave, that he realized that his hiding place had been entered during his absence. Every article that the place contained had been examined. The tea and coffee had been poured from their respective containers. Matchboxes had been opened, and even the salt and sugar had been emptied from their sacks. But most remarkable of all, each and every commodity had been gathered up and put back again into its container with most fastidious care. From the cupboard, Stafford turned his attention to his cooking utensils and found that they had been used. Someone had cooked a meal during his absence. Yet it had been some time back, for the ashes had long been cold when he built the fire. Frowning, he stepped outside. Could there still be someone lurking about? Out in the darkness, however, there was no sound save the steady swish-swish of the rain and the soughing of the wind. With an impatient shrug, Stafford re-entered the cave. Anyone who had been here when the storm started would be in the cave when he arrived, or, if they had been frightened away by his approach, they would have left tracks in the saturated soil about the entrance. Dismissing the matter from his mind for the time, he went about the preparation of supper. One had to eat, even if callers had been there who had forgotten to leave their cards. And after all, this spot was but one, the most poorly concealed by far, of his several retreats. If strangers had found his cabin in the giant yellow pines, that would be something over which to feel agitation. As to what the stranger or strangers sought, he could only guess. Certainly it was not food, or they would have taken more. It could be money, or information concerning his identity. Last of all, it might be that they were seeking the piece of leather reposing in Stafford's pocket. Of all things that they might be searching for, he least desired that it should be this last, nor did he well see how anyone could know of its existence. And yet, the other half of the leather map was missing. It was barely possible that someone had gained possession of this other part, and was hunting his half, determined to get it by fair means or foul. Stafford, on the other hand, had determined to unravel the riddle alone, unaided, except for the incomplete drawing set in his possession. Supper finished, he went outside again and prowled about the flats. The horses were eating quietly, and the sixth sense which his long stay in the wilderness had developed failed to warn him of any imminent danger. Going inside once more, he began the work of making the smaller and more compact packs that he could take with him on his present expedition. So far as this particular cave was concerned, he expected never to return to it again. When the packing had been completed, Stafford sat down at the rough table, and placing a candle in front of him, mulled the leather from his pocket and removed its protecting wrapper of oilcloth. Then he spread it out in front of him. The drawing upon the leather had been done with some sort of wild berry juice, Stafford had decided, for he doubted if anyone who had to use leather for this work would have possessed ink. At any rate, the lines of the drawing still showed, as did the words of the broken sentences beneath, which read as follows: of the place Morgan found while here in 52, it to anyone who John and me know drinks got a wallop at's below, it makes it trouble is you can't to do much work. About the place, all right almost to it fall back. Now, but hope to come another crack at it. Case we don't, but the ones to finish P.S. greater than we had a quarrel, danged near fought. I told John we'd each go our own way. I cut the map in two. He can eat his half if he wants to. Above this writing was the outline of a heavily timbered plateau with a perpendicular cliff rising on the south end towards still greater heights. On a tailless slope at the foot of this cliff were straight lines with heavy dots at frequent intervals. Below these lines, at the foot of the slope, and at a spot where the shoulder of cliff projected, was a flat spot with a circle at the center. By the side of this circle was the facetious statement, "Drinks and gold." Above the straight rows and apparently under the edge of the cliff was the rude outline of dwellings, probably cliff houses, Stafford had long before decided. Thoughtfully, he stuck the leather back into his pocket. All that he had to go on in locating this spot was the place in which he found the body of Bill Ryder. That, and the mirage picture which had visited him several summers before on a sultry July day. In that picture, he had seen cliff houses staring from the entrance of a huge cave at the base of a large cliff, while in front of the cliff was a mass of green timber. But whether on a mesa or not, he could not say. All that he knew for certain was that he had never seen the spot depicted in the mirage. Yet the timber beneath the cliff and the houses looking out were all in perfect agreement with the map. If he only had the other half that depicted the trail up to the mesa. Getting to his feet, he gathered up a piece of paper he had taken from some bacon and tossed it onto the fire. As it blazed upward, illuminating the soot-blackened rocks around, Stafford found himself staring at an imprint of a small hand upon the sooty rock. It was slender as well as small, and the thought flashed through Stafford's mind that it might easily belong to the boy with whom he had talked in Rush. Of course, the idea was silly. It was silly to think of any one youngster down in this country for that matter. And so, dismissing the matter temporarily from his mind, he rolled up in his blanket and went to sleep. Chapter 3. For a space of 2 weeks thereafter, Stafford cruised alone through the broken labyrinths of his domain, searching unceasingly for some clue that might lead him to the spot for which he sought. All the time, however, he kept on the alert for any sign of men upon his trail. There was none, and he smiled with satisfaction, thinking how his wilderness had swallowed and bewildered the men whom he did not doubt had followed. 5 days after leaving that first cave, he visited a second retreat of his, a makeshift cabin located in a clump of cedar. To his amazement, he found that it had been occupied, and not only occupied, but recently. Food had been cooked from the scanty store which the place contained, and his blankets had been slept in. Everything about the place had been left scrupulously neat, in better order, in fact, than Stafford had ever left it. Dishes washed, bedding folded, and the cobwebs wiped from the cracked mirror on the wall. There had even been an attempt to sweep the place with a handmade broom of sage. He could see where the dirt had been gathered upon a thin piece of board that had come from an old packing case. Going outside, he found where it had been thrown well away from the door, and by the spot was the imprint of a shoe. With a start, he noted that it was a small shoe, one that could easily match the imprint of the hand back in the cave. After that, he searched the place feverishly, but found no indication that anyone but the wearer of the small boyish shoe had been there. Twice more, in the next few days, he found evidences that retreats of his had been visited by this same mysterious personage, and mixed with his alarm at finding the places had been discovered was an eagerness to see what bit of hominess had been imparted by the unknown occupant. Yet it was maddening not to be able to see the person who made such free use of his belongings. On the 12th day following his return to the forlorn country, he picked up a bunch of riders through his field glasses. It was Sheriff Ross leading a posse. Filled with bitter enjoyment, he watched their progress from the top of a high butte. Certainly, they were a long way from taking him. In an airline, he was not over 2 miles from them. As they would be compelled to travel, it was nearer 30. Moreover, they were following no trail. It was all blind guesswork for the sheriff, the kind of guesswork that wears out horses, frays the nerves of men, and leaves them with nothing but empty hands in the end. From his vast knowledge of the country, Stafford could tell right close to where they would be camped for the night. Content with the knowledge thus acquired, he went to where Oliver's saddle horse and the 2 pack animals were tied among some cedars. Mounting the sorrel, he started down into a gorge running in the opposite direction to the one the posse was following. Clouds were beginning to scrape the higher pinnacles, and Stafford was anticipating the coming of the first fall storm. It would be cold as well as wet by morning, and he decided to be shielded from the weather in the cabin where no one, not even his mysterious housekeeper, had ever entered. Riding down the canyon, he became conscious of wood smoke sucking up the gorge toward him. Somewhere below, men were camped. His knowledge of the region told him he was coming to flats crowded with cedar, giant sage, and wild hawthorn. There would be plenty of covert to conceal all his movements, and accordingly he decided to move closer and investigate. The forlorn country showed signs of becoming crowded. It was nearing noon, and as he advanced, an odor of boiling coffee told him that he was getting perilously close to his fellow men again. Had that not been enough, there was a sharp cry of pain to further direct his movements. It was a wild, stark cry, laden with a bitterness and hopelessness that stirred Stafford to the very depths of his being, especially since it was not a sound issuing from the toughened lips of an adult inured by years to a measure of suffering, but one that seemed boyish and appealing for help that the suppliant knew might never come to him. Flinging himself from the horse, Stafford moved in the direction of the sounds with all the speed that even a measure of caution would permit. Soon he was rewarded by a view of a fire dancing like some yellow-suited gnome in a tiny clearing among the sage. To the left of the fire was a dead cedar, and tied to it by his thumbs so that his toes just touched the ground was a diminutive denim-clad figure. Stafford could not see the face of the unfortunate, as he was behind, yet instantly he felt that the figure's size compared exactly with the imprints left by his unseen visitor of recent days. Grouped around the tortured one were 3 tall, bearded men, and one smooth-faced individual, who Stafford instantly recognized with a feeling of dislike was his own double. One of the whiskered trio held a heavy quirt in his hand. "Billy," he said, looking at the shrinking form before him, "I've tried to be a good father to you since your mother died." "Jake." "You haven't been," came the clear, pain-shot accents of the tied one. "You're a brute, and I hate you. Besides, you're not my father." "That's neither here nor there, Billy," responded the bearded man. "You've got unmanageable, and I'm going to break your spirit unless you come to yourself and tell me all you've been doing the past 10 days. Hurry up now, and tell me what you've been doing." "Nothing that's any of your business," the prisoner sobbed angrily. The whip-wielder's brows contracted into a scowl of primitive ferocity, while his lower jaw protruded threateningly. "When anyone runs off like you did, and lives for 10 days, and comes through it in as good shape as you did, it comes pretty nigh being our business, don't it, Nick?" The remark was addressed to the smooth-faced man, who nodded. "Yep, Billy, we've got a right to know where you've been. Someone's fed you, and we've got to know who and where." "You haven't got to know anything about what I did," moaned the captive. "If I can live without help from any of you, that's my business. I don't want any food, water, or anything else of yours. Turn me loose and I'll shift for myself." The quartet laughed, and the smooth-faced man said with ugly softness, "That's just the point. You haven't shifted for yourself. Someone's doing the shiftin' for you, and we suspicion he's the gent we're after. Oliver pays your dad good wages, and you can see your dad can't afford to have you double-crossin' him." "He's not my dad," came the angry retort, "and I won't tell anything." "You don't, Z. But you've got to tell. You know something we don't. No kid with bare hands ever lived out here 10 days without help, and come through as comfortable looking as you have," answered Nick. "Hurry up and tell us." "TL not," moaned the other. "No use," said the man with the whip. "Some folks have just got to have sense licked into 'em. I too." He lifted the whip high as he spoke, but the crack of a revolver clipped off both his speech and the whip at the same instant. With only the stub clutched in his fingers, the man whirled at the same instant as his 3 companions, and all found themselves staring into the muzzles of Stafford's guns. "Stick 'em high," snapped the latter, and 4 sets of hands shot skyward. Without saying another word, Stafford circled toward the youth who was held by his thumbs. At the youngster's side, he paused. "You men, turn your backs to me," he ordered, "but remember to hold your flippers high." Like figures from a ballet, the 4 obeyed. "Keep your faces straight ahead," clipped Stafford. "If one of you turns, I'll blow his brains out." There was no doubt that the men were impressed, for they stood as rigid as ramrods. Softly, one of Stafford's guns slid back into its holster, while the other continued to cover the four. His free hand reached down and pulled his hunting knife from its sheath. After that, he moved around so he could see the thongs holding the boy, and watch the men at the same time. 2 slashes of the sharp blade, and the boy was free. So far, Stafford had been too busy to look at the youngster's face. Now, as the boy staggered back, he realized it was the one who had questioned him in rush. "Kid," he said, "are you as game as you was that other time?" "You bet I am," came the quick response. "I'm ready for anything." "Then step over and relieve those 4 horned toads of their guns." Quickly the boy stooped down, and picking up his hat thrust it over his thick short-cropped hair, then moved with swift grace to obey Stafford's order. At the finish, he turned and looked at his benefactor. "Break them open and throw the shells into the brush, as far as you can," the latter ordered. With slender, expert fingers, the youth executed the order. "Now," said Stafford, speaking low to suppress the terrible anger that burned within him, "I want the man who was so keen on doing the whipping to step up to this limb where the kid was tied. Step lively." The broken whip fell from the man's fingers. Then with a stiff, unnatural gait, he moved to the indicated spot. "Right below the limb. There. Now reach," ordered Stafford. "Reach until you feel your muscles crackle." "Good," he exclaimed then. As he spoke, his steely glance flitted swiftly to the smooth-faced replica of himself. "Get over there, you cur," he commanded, "and tie up this believer in corporal punishment, thumbs like he tied the kid." The man who had been addressed as Nick shot forward to obey. "Use the same thongs that were on the kid," Stafford continued, "and tie him high and tight. Go on. Higher, higher. Make him come up on his toes." A half snarl, half groan escaped the man who was being tied. "Quit," he roared, his eyes blazing with maniacal fire. "If you pull on that thumb any more, I'll kill you when idjit loose." "And if you don't, I will before he does," came Stafford's voice with a crackle to it like that of new ice. "There, that will do." Swinging on the tips of his toes, the burly man spun around till he faced Stafford. He poured a torrent of abuse at his captor, while perspiration ran down his face. When he looked at the man called Nick, his glance contained such utter ferocity that the latter shrank back. "I had to do it, Critchlow," he muttered. "Yes, and that's not all you have to do," stated Stafford. "Go over there and pick up that rope." Nick obeyed. "Double it." Again, the command was carried out. "Good," approved Stafford. "Now step up and use it on your friend Critchlow. Put some weight behind it." His face ashy, the fellow complied. "Harder," urged Stafford. "If you can't do better than that, I'll let Critchlow work on you." Instantly, the blows increased in violence, while the man being punished writhed and howled. "Some people have to have sense beaten into them," Stafford explained dryly. "But you can stop now, and we'll see if we've accomplished anything. Now, Critchlow, I'm going to ask you some questions. If I get fair answers, Teal'll not have you licked anymore. It all depends on you, how much more of this you get. Just remember that it doesn't make a snap's worth of difference to me whether you want to talk or not. It's your thumbs that are swelling, not mine." "Hurry," panted Critchlow. "Don't you see I'm about crazy?" "First," said Stafford slowly, "I want to know what your business is down here. Tell the truth, man, if you're in a hurry to get loose." Critchlow's lips worked. We all are working for Oliver." "Good," nodded Stafford. "You answered that one honestly. Now, what are you doing for Oliver?" "You know blamed well what we was trying to do," roared the tied man. "We was trying to get you." Stafford smiled. "I suspected something of the sort. What did Oliver expect to do with me?" "No, wait. That's too hard a question. I can't expect you to say you intended to murder me in cold blood. Tell me what it was that Oliver had against me." "Let me loose," moaned Critchlow. "I'm being pulled apart." He was afraid you'd find something down here. I don't know what. And did he tell you to make the boy here search that cave of mine? I never made Billy search the cave. He lies. He did, cried the boy. He was afraid to go in himself and sent me while he waited outside. But that was before I knew just how awful he was. Mother died down here alone while he was up in Rush carousing. I wanted to stay with her, and he wouldn't let me. He's only a stepfather. And what were you to look for, Billy? A soft piece of leather with writing on it. Yes, that's right, howled Critchlow. For mercy's sake, let me loose. What do you know about mercy? Demanded Stafford, in a voice so terrible that all the 5 persons about him shrank away. You come down here to hunt down and kill, for pay a man against whom you had nothing personal. You leave a lonely woman to die in the wilderness alone while you seek your own pleasure. You abuse a poor heartsick kid till he runs away from you for very loathing, and then when you finally find him, you torture him for going. Critchlow was trembling like a leaf, and the other men of the quartet were ashen-faced, as though they felt themselves standing on the brink of oblivion. For the moment all calmness was gone from Stafford. He was a raging volcano of fiery feelings that might at any instant send death belching from his 6 guns. Thus he stood for a space, struggling to master his emotions, and when his face did calm, those present breathed easier, for the men had felt the icy breath of death close at their sides. One more question, Critchlow. Did Oliver hire your friend Nick here to masquerade as me in all these lawless affairs, including the beating up of old Ben? Yes. Do you think Sheriff Ross knows Nick and what he's up to? I don't know. All right, Nick. That will do. Cut your playmate down. Loosened, Critchlow stood, sucking his swollen thumbs and glaring at his companions. Critchlow, said Stafford, when your fingers get nimble again, Jay want you to tie up the 2 that have had no part in these proceedings. Tie 'em tight, back to back. Tie 'em good and tight. If you don't, I swing you from that limb again. Te'll fix 'em, muttered Critchlow, and with Stafford's eyes watching every move, he bound their wrists and arms till the hemp bit into their flesh and made them cringe. You did a good job, approved Stafford. Now, do a better one for Nick. Wait. We'll walk over to his horse, and you can lash him into the saddle. Tie him so that he'll sit there as long as the horse's hair stays on. I'm taking Nick for a ride. In another 5 minutes, Stafford's duplicate sat stiff and helpless in the saddle, arms trussed behind and legs tied by a rope running beneath the horse's belly. He'll do, stated Stafford and glanced uncertainly at the boy. Kid, he asked, do you want to go along with me or to stay here? The small, wistful face paled beneath the felt hat. I'd rather be dead than stay here, came the low, determined answer. Stafford frowned. This is a wild, rough country. No place for you to be, under the best of circumstances, and I'm a hunted man. Still, if you say go, why, go it is. At that, you're probably safer with me than left here with these brutes. I want to go. All right. That settles it. Pick out the horse you want, and we'll be leaving. Billy stepped toe a white-stockinged black and vaulted lightly into the saddle. Critchlow, said Stafford, you can lead your friend Nick's horse. He'll walk beside you and tell you where to go. What are you going to do with me? Croaked Nick. You've got nothing to do but guess, so amuse yourself, retorted Stafford. What I should do is to fold you up in a wooden envelope and ship you back to Hades. A little later, the 4 came to where Stafford had left his pack animals and saddle horse. Mounting, he took the reins to Nick's horse from Critchlow and pointed west. Get going, Critchlow. Travel at a dog trot. I'm in a hurry, all of a sudden. I ain't no good at walkin', protested the man on the ground. My ankles is weak and a breath short. Me. And I know your heart's bad, cut in Stafford, but a man never knows what he can do till he comes to an emergency. You're going to rise to this one, or fall down permanent. Get going." And so they set off, winding in and out among the clumps of cedar and greasewood, with Critchlow lumbering ahead like a huge ungainly bear. As he jogged along, his breath wheezed louder and louder, until at last it came in choking gasps and his legs weaved drunkenly beneath him. Stafford knew that the fellow was almost exhausted, and he was not surprised when Critchlow went down in a heap, the matted hair on his forehead trailing in the dust. Turning a strained face upward, the man looked at Stafford with tortured eyes. "Shoot if you want to," he panted, "but I'm done." Stafford smiled. "I'm satisfied, Critchlow. Your efforts have been convincing. You are at liberty now to walk back and untie the other two men whenever you are able. Nick, Billy, and I will just ride on. But remember one thing, if you trail me again, you may not get off so easily." With that, Stafford urged his horse ahead, and the little cavalcade passed the haggard figure panting on the ground. Chapter 4. For a space Stafford rode, oblivious to everything but his own thoughts. And as he rode, the clouds, together with the approach of night, cast a deep somber gloom over the broken landscape. At last he became conscious of the boy's small form riding at his side. As usual, the soft felt hat was low over his forehead, and he stared straight ahead, probably not wanting anyone to read the lonesomeness in his eyes, thought Stafford, and threw aside his own problems to try to cheer this small waif of fate. "You're a right good housekeeper, Billy," he remarked lightly. "I surely appreciate the way you left things at my different camps when you visited them." "Yes," came the reply, "I tried to leave things clean. It was the least I could do, after stealing things from you." "No one calls getting a little food stealing in this part of the world, Billy," the man answered gently. "Besides, you more than paid for it in cleaning things up the way you did. You must have been awfully lonesome, Billy, staying by yourself that way. Why didn't you let me find you? Or didn't you know how to?" "Yes, I knew how. I saw you once or twice from the brush close to your camps." "And yet you never came out and spoke to me," marveled Stafford. "What kind of a fellow do you think I am, anyhow, Billy? Do you think I'd be anything but nice to you after the kind of break you gave me back at Rush?" Billy seemed to shrink and get smaller in his saddle. I didn't know," he answered in that small, clear voice. "Well, you ought to know," Stafford reproved gently. "You're shivering right now. It's getting cold. I'll give you my coat." "Oh, no," protested the youth, "you'll need it yourself." "No, till not," laughed Stafford. "I'm old and tough. Besides, my wrath will keep me warm. There, slip into it." Billy obeyed, still looking anywhere but at Stafford, who, when the job was finished, gave him a friendly pat. "No use feelin' blue, old-timer. Everything will work out fine." "Maybe," came the doubting answer. "What are you intending to do with me?" "Well, Billy," said Stafford with forced lightness, "that's a question. I'd like to ride with you back to civilization and see you get settled fine, but right now I can't. There's things stopping me, so I guess I'll have to figure on turning you over to someone else to do it. There's an officer of the law over here a few miles. I can likely trust him to take you out." "Who is it?" "Sheriff Ross and some of his cohorts." Silence followed. "But he's looking for you," the youth stated in a hushed voice. "It's dangerous for you to go there. I don't want you to. I won't let you," he ended almost fiercely. "Gosh, Billy, you're spunky when you get started. What if the sheriff is looking for me? That doesn't mean he'll get me, does it? I got away at Rush, and I'm a lot more at home down here." "I don't want to go with the sheriff," Billy stated with wonderful positiveness. "I want to stay with you, Mr. Stafford. Chad's my name, Billy. Call me Chad. And I'm mighty sorry, partner, but it isn't possible for you to stay with me. Besides, it wouldn't be fair to leave anything as despicable and low down as Nick here with Ross. unless there was something mighty fine left at the same time to take the horrid taste out of his mouth. "I don't want to go with them," Billy reiterated. "I'd rather stay with you. And I'd like mighty well to have you, but it's not the thing, so forget it, partner. I'm a hunted man, one of the kind that sometimes has to sleep on naked rocks, go without meals or water quite frequently, and have sporting gentlemen try out all sorts of high-powered artillery on him." "Oh," gasped the boy, "that's horrible. But I want to stay with you, just the same." "But good gravy, son, you can't. Still, you don't need to get excited about what I said. It won't be that bad. If was just drawing a black picture, so you'd be glad to leave me. Got any relatives around the country?" Billy shook his head. "How about some friends you could go to? I was never allowed in town bag enough to have any. Just in and out the same day, mostly because that not very often." "You'll need money and a friend when you get to Rush," said Stafford. Reaching into his pocket, he produced a small roll of greenbacks. "Here, Billy, stuff this away in your Levi's where no one will guess you have it. Then when you get to Rush, ask for Bill Green. Tell him I sent you to him. Tell him the whole story, and he'll see that you get started out all right. I don't want the money." "But you're going to take it, Billy," said Stafford sternly. "You've got to take it. Here." Under the pressure of Stafford's insistence, a small hand reached out and took the money and silently slipped it into a pocket. "I don't know how to thank you," the boy said. "There's nothing to thank me for," Stafford stated definitely. "And remember one thing, Billy. That's good clean cash, earned by honest labor. Nothing that anybody need be ashamed of taking." After this, they rode in silence, till the night was all about them, filled with the mysterious voices of the wind whispering and wailing about trees and crags. With the darkness came storm, only this time it was a soft, steady drizzle that had a penetrating chill to it. "How can you find those people in the dark?" Billy asked at last. "He'll find them right enough," assured Stafford. "I know this particular part of the forlorn country, in the same way that a cat knows all the roofs and alleys in his own block. How long do you think it will be?" "Pretty soon now. I think I hear voices. In fact, I know I do. Time to stop Nick's mouth with a handkerchief. He might break into speech at the wrong time." Stafford's duplicate was too far gone from riding, in his bound condition, to resist anything. Passively, he allowed the cloth to be thrust between his jaws and into place. The gagging done, the trio moved forward again, until they could see where the flames of a crackling campfire drove back the heaped-up shadows from a little space. A tent had been erected close to the fire, so that the heat beat in at the open tent flaps. In this aperture were several figures. Just beyond this tent was a second smaller one, almost hidden by the larger shelter. A low fire was also burning by this second tent. Stafford turned to Billy. "I'm getting off now, and going over to make arrangements for your welcome," he stated in a whisper. "Stay here with Nick till I come back." Almost instantly, the shadows swallowed him. Worming his way in and out through clumps of dripping brush, he found himself at a point but a few yards from this second tent. As with the other, the flaps were back, allowing the warmth of the blaze to enter the tent. In this opening sat two smokers, and when one of them pushed a piece of dry sage from a pile within the tent onto the blaze, Stafford saw that they were Oliver and Sheriff Ross. They were conversing in tones so low that Stafford could not hear, and accordingly, he moved around until he was behind the tent. The canvas side walls were staked to the ground with iron pins, and Stafford was compelled to remove two of these before he could gently lift the wall and worm his way under it. He was halfway through when another limb of sage struck the blaze, sending the light spurting into the room. At that instant, Sam Oliver chose to look back, and Stafford flattened himself out upon the ground. Only the pile of sage kept him from being discovered at that instant. "What you always craning your neck about for, Sam?" asked the sheriff. Oliver laughed harshly. It feel uneasy down here, Jake. I know this camping out is pretty much the same thing as I've done all my life, but this trip's kind of different. You know, Jake, big game hunters sometimes get to feelin' mighty uneasy when they're out after a man-eaten tiger. You know, sometimes them tigers come right down to the camp and take one of the hunters apart. This storm, the part of the world we're in, and the man we're after, all combined got me to wonderin'. Stafford is smart, Jake, and he's no coward. Maybe it would be well for us to have a guard out. Ross's amused laugh answered this statement. Stafford is smart, Sam, and that's just the reason he'll not show up here tonight. He's not fool enough to risk pesterin' round this crowd on his lonesome. This is really a tough posse, if I do say it. They need to be. We're out after a hard man to catch. But one we've got to get, Sam, or you'll not be sleepin' easy till we do. He'll be hatin' me, Jake, and there's not much to keep a man who hates you from reachin' you in this part of the world. Ross nodded. I know. He can pick you off with a rifle that's got telescopic sights, and be so far away that the report never reaches your ears. Or he can come at night like a sheep killin' grizzly and slaughter you in your bed. Your comin' out so strong against him at the courthouse may have been a bad thing, Sam. I know it, agreed Oliver, but I had no idea that he would escape me. Jake, we've got to get him. You've got to get him, not me, corrected the sheriff. A man has to have a strong incentive to keep up a hunt for long in this country. T'sn't his breakin' jail on you enough, growled Oliver. Do you want to be the laughing stock of the whole country when you get back to Rush? Stafford made fools of so many of us that day that I'd not be much noticed in the jam. Moreover, Ross added, I'm thinkin' I can let it circulate that I let him escape to prevent a lynchin'. Ross, what is it you want? Snarled Oliver. I'm ready to lay my cards all on the table if you'll do the same. If it's money you want to keep up this search, tell me how much it'll take to stop the itching in your fingers. Maybe it's not money I'm after, answered the sheriff slyly. There's other things of value besides currency. Probably it would be a fine thing for you to tell me what you're after down in this country. What has Stafford got that makes you so determined to do away with him? It must be something of great value to induce a man of your kind to risk the animosity of a fellow like Stafford. People have called him lazy, never to his face though, and always he has been considered a good man to leave alone. Yet you've socked your tomahawk in the war post and gone out after his scalp. How come? Stafford, now lying breathless behind the sage, could hear every syllable of their speech, even see the writhing of Oliver's muscles as the sheriff pursued his pumping tactics. It's a map, a piece of one, Oliver blurted out at last. I'm sure he's got it, and I want it. A half of a map is of no use to anyone, but the whole would be worth a fortune. The sheriff laughed sneeringly. Another of these maps of lost mines, and you've been crack-brained enough to fall for that sort of stuff. If you've as little wits as that, I reckon there'll be no great harm done if Stafford does get you. But this is different. The map is of a genuine spot. The fellow I got my part from told me that much. He got it first hand from one of the partners who made the original discovery. The doting old loon carried it around with him for 40 years and never made any effort to find the place. Wouldn't even ask anyone if they had heard of the other piece for fear the one he had would be stolen. He was justified, wasn't he? Asked Ross dryly. Ain't I to understand that you've got the half he had? If it was as valuable as you say it was, it must have been stolen. I've been wondering, Sam, about that beating up old Ben got. You didn't get this map you're talking about then, did you? You're shrewd, admitted Oliver. Yes, I got it then. One time, about a year before, the old chap told me he had this map and showed it to me when he was drunk. There's only one thing you can get drunk on. That's good strong pear wine. I carried a quart of it clean down from the north end of the state to do the trick. Man, how it loosened up his tongue. He talked like a sewing machine agent after he had a pint or so under his belt. He got this piece of map from a man named John Morgan, who was just ready to cash in from a case o' blood poisoning. Old Ben made this Morgan's last hours as easy as he could, and the fellow turned the map over to him with directions that he give it or send it to some relatives somewhere or another. But old Ben had different ideas than that. He hung on to the map, took it out nights, and gloated over it when he might have been hunting for the place where all this gold was located. Not a vein, I mean, but pure gold that had been made into images of one kind and another and ornaments, hundreds of pounds of it, just waiting for someone to pack it off. Why didn't these two that first discovered it do the packin'? Demanded Ross. Couldn't, this Morgan told old Ben. The Indians got after them, and they was lucky to escape for their lives. Have you got this piece of map with you? Oliver reached into his pocket and fished out a piece of leather and handed it to the sheriff, who smoothed it over his knee. The directions look definite enough, he said after a minute, but they don't go far enough. Why didn't they finish this drawing? I told you it was only a piece, said Oliver. The rest is in Stafford's possession. How do you know it is? Why else would he be spending all his time chasing round down here? There ain't any other reason. And besides, he give it away here about a year back. How so? While he was in the hospital, after getting thrown off his horse, one of the nurses that took care of him was a cousin of mine. Stafford wasn't satisfied a minute till they dug through his clothes and got out a package. He kept that package under his pillow all the time. My cousin got so curious about it that when she give him a hypo one night to put him to sleep, she opened the bundle and found it held the piece of leather that matches this. Of course, she didn't know anything about this one, and the whole business was Greek to her, but it clinches his having it. Yes, meditated Ross, and it makes me feel a lot more certain there's something down here. Stafford is long-headed, with all his peculiarities. I'm bettin' he's got more evidence about this business than you have, Sam. Well, here's my idea. I'll go in with you and help dispose of Stafford for half the treasure if there is one, or for 10,000 in cash if there isn't. What you say? All I can say is that I'll do it, retorted Oliver. Haven't you got a half Nelson, headlock, flying mare, and several other holds on me? I wouldn't be surprised if I had, Sam. Well, now that we understand each other, I want to tell you what a prime chump you'd make of yourself by killing Stafford till you had his part of the map. You've got a murder squad down here somewhere, haven't you? Yes, and I wish they'd kill the feller even if the knowledge of the map did go with him. But it wouldn't. He'd have it on him. Maybe, and maybe not. The thing for us to do is to bag this wolf of the forlorn alive. Then, if the map isn't on him, we can offer him his freedom in exchange for it. After the map's in our hands, I'll turn him over to you and... That's an ambitious program. The statement came from Stafford, and the tones of his voice stabbed into the sensibilities of the plotters like knives. Make a sound, continued Stafford, and your hearts stop beating. Chapter 5. Absolute silence followed this statement, a silence in which the faint crackle of the fire and the pattering of the rain on the tent top seemed amplified to amazing proportions. Stafford, with a cocked revolver in either hand, had risen from behind the sage and stood looking down at the cowering pair with a face as hard as granite. A fine officer you're proving yourself tonight, Ross, said Stafford, after a silence that fairly screamed. I came here expecting to prove my own honesty to an honest man, and when I get here, I find the man I had depended on is a worse crook than the others. And still, there was no statement from the two men by the fire. In fact, there was nothing that they could say. Stafford leaned forward till the muzzles of his guns almost touched the pair. Unbuckle your gun belts, he ordered, and if either of you touches a gun, I shoot." With trembling fingers, the two obeyed. "Stand up." Still shaking with nervous dread, the pair rose as nearly upright as the walls of the tent would permit. With his guns still in command of the pair, Stafford kicked the gun belts that had slid from their waists into a corner. "Walk to the back of the tent," he directed, "and face the canvas." When they had complied, he said, "Ross, you get a pocket knife and cut the end out of the tent, the whole thing, so we can walk out in a bunch and keep an eye on one another." A ripping of fabric followed, and soon the wet, chill air rushed in through the gap made by Ross's knife. "Before we get where there isn't a bit of light, I want that map, Oliver," said Stafford. "I saw Ross hand it back to you, and considering all you've got me into the last few weeks, I know any honest man would say I had it coming." A moment later, the leather was in Stafford's possession. "That makes us ready to travel," he observed. "And don't try to pull away from the muzzle of either of these guns, for if you do, I'll span the gap with a bullet. When I jab one of you in the back hard with a gun, it means for that fellow to turn to the right or left, depending on which one I shove against." "Where are we going?" whispered the sheriff. "I'm taking you out, to turn a man and a boy over to you," answered Stafford. "The man's the one who played my part in all the little nastiness that have been wished off on me the past months. He's a skunk, and ought to make a real addition to your bunch. The other one, the boy, is a prince, and I guess even you, Ross, will see that a kid gets a fair deal. Take him out to civilization and treat him right. If you don't, sometime I'm going to be around to see why you didn't. Now let's move." A few minutes later, the trio were back where Stafford had left his horses. There was barely enough light from the posse's campfires at this point to make out the outline of the different animals. The horses were still there, Stafford's mount as well as the animal on which the gagged and bound Nick sat like a ramrod. But of Billy and his horse there was no sign. Stafford experienced a deep regret, coupled with worry. What had become of the kid? Had he decided that he would rather shift for himself again than to be turned over to the posse? And if so, why? "Where is the boy you was talking about?" asked Ross in the undertone which he deemed essential to keep from being annihilated. "Gone," said Stafford, "and I can hardly stay to look him up. I doubt if you'll run onto him, but if you do, treat him well. Oliver must know of him. He was with his bunch of killers." "I don't know anything about any boy," growled the sheepman, "but I do know most certainly that that's my horse you're riding and my pack animals you're ussin'." "Yes," said Stafford, "they're good animals. I think I'll use them a while longer." "You'll wish you hadn't, you." "Shut up, Sam," said Ross in a savage undertone. "First thing, you'll be lifting your voice, and when you do, you and me'll start sailing toward the pearly gates." Stafford moved over to his horse. Then slipping one gun into its holster, he swung into the saddle. "That was a neat piece of horsemanship," commented Ross. "Your eyes nor your gun, neither of them ever left me." "I can handle a horse somewhat," answered Stafford soberly, "but understanding this country is my long suit. I'm leaving you now, but don't make the mistake of trying to burst your lungs yelling too soon. I have real good luck shooting by sound." "Next time we meet, things will be different," predicted Ross with nasty pleasantness. "I reckon they will," replied Stafford, "but maybe not just the way you're hoping." With that, he whistled softly to the pack horses, and turning, led the way into the night. As he rode, he listened for excitement, but there was none. An ironic smile curved his lips at the continued stillness. Ross and Oliver were not eager to announce the way they had been surprised. Besides, they might well consider the futility of pursuit through the night and the storm. Stafford rode in silence for a space, busy with thoughts of Oliver the ruthless, Ross the knave, and most of all of Billy the paradox. Queer kid. Afraid of being alone in this wilderness, as any normal kid would be, yet deliberately hiking out alone in the night and the storm rather than be turned over to Ross. Stafford found himself wondering if he had done the right thing in insisting that Billy should go with the posse. Yet what else was there to do? And he had run a great risk to give the boy the opportunity that he had refused. Queer how shy the boy was. Queer yet how grown up and unusual was his manner of speech. It had a gentleness to it, hard to associate with a boy. Yet he had spirit too, a stronger spirit than most men. As Stafford dwelt upon the pleasant peculiarities of his late companion, he found himself sighing. Just then the backpack horse began to snort and act peculiarly. Apparently he was frightened by something, and pressing the button of his electric torch, Stafford turned back to see what was the nature of the trouble. And as he looked, he felt his scalp tingle, for the tarp covering the animal's pack suddenly lunged upward for nearly a foot, while two ghost-like canvas-covered wings shot out, one on either side. Bewildered beyond speech, Stafford rode his snorting horse forward and, grabbing hold of the tarp, pulled it back. There, with one slim arm flung up to shield his face from the light, was Billy. With a strange feeling of wonder, Stafford felt his heart leap with joy at the sight. Reason might tell him that the boy should not be here, but his heart was unashamedly glad at the miscarriage of his plans. Still, he must assume a measure of dignified displeasure to live up to the old tradition of adults who have had their authority defied by youth. "Billy," he demanded sternly, "what are you doing here?" For once, there was no hat shielding the small oval face. Stafford, looking at the graceful sweep of the thick dark eyebrows, the delicate pink in the petal-like softness of Billy's cheeks, found himself marveling anew. Then, when two pearl-like tears twinkled mistily in the long sweeping lashes, and the red bow of the small lips quivered, he felt a new tempestuous feeling sweeping through him. "Don't cry, Billy," he found himself saying anxiously. "I didn't mean to be so rough." Two small hands rose and covered the tear-streaked face, and Billy's shoulders shook convulsively. "I couldn't stay with that man," the diminutive figure said, sobbing. "Sheriff Ross knows me by sight, and he tries to kiss me." "Billy?" ejaculated Stafford, consternation and understanding leaping into his mind. "Good gosh. And I thought you were a boy." A little smile mingled with the tears, as Billy lifted her face and looked straight into Stafford's eyes. Then a shudder ran over her. At this, Stafford's arms reached out and curved protecting about the slight, shivering form. "You poor kid. I ought to have understood sooner. A girl like you out here in this wilderness, and under these circumstances." And looking up into the stormy night, Stafford, a forlorn, prayed to the God of his fathers for strength and wisdom to guide himself and this girl through the dilemma in which they were placed. Chapter 6. "What are you going to do?" asked Billy, after she had gained a measure of composure. "I don't know," said Stafford slowly. "No man could know what to do offhand in this case. We'll spend tonight in my cabin. Perhaps by tomorrow I can think things out. Get into my saddle, Billy. T'll walk the rest of the way." "I don't like that," demurred the girl. "I need to, anyhow," Stafford replied, a shade impatient. "The trail through here is hard to feel." 2 hours later, Stafford led the way through a narrow slit between smooth, wet walls of rock. After the horses had passed, he dropped a maple pole into the crotches of 2 cedars, one on either side of the natural gateway, thus making it proof against the straying of the stock. Getting in the lead again, he strode swiftly forward through a damp meadow, with giant pines standing all around its edge. They were yellow pines, some of them 6 or 7 feet in diameter, the great bark scales glistening like polished shields in the light of the electric torch that he held firmly in his hand. Without hesitation, Stafford moved toward a group of 3 tremendous trees standing close to the far end of the crag-surrounded flat. 2 of the trees in this group were in their prime, while the third had dead snags sticking out among the green foliage of its healthiest limbs. Beneath the trees showing the dead branches, and with one end built squarely against it, was a small cabin with a wonderfully inviting air about its sturdy construction. Stafford strode up to the door, and removing the bar, flung it open. After that, he explored its interior with the yellow pencil of his flashlight before entering himself. Satisfied, he stepped across the threshold, and walking over to a shelf, procured candles, 2 of which he lit, and set in their wooden holders, 1 on each end of a small table made of poles. Going out again, he lifted the tired Billy from the horse and steadied her for a second while the numbness left her limbs. After that, he guided her over the irregularities of the rough rock path and into the shelter of the pine log walls. Quickly, Billy's eyes took in the simple, masculine atmosphere of the place. Blankets, guns, and provisions. It held an abundance of them all. There was also a 3-legged stool, a bench for the water bucket, and a tiny stove. Over to the far end, with a huge bear skin hanging behind it, was a narrow bunk whose bottom was made of interlacing leather thongs. At the end of this bunk was a shelf containing a row of well-worn books. "Sorry," said Stafford as he watched his companion's swift survey. "I should have had more conveniences, but to tell the truth, I never expected a visitor. This was built strictly as a one-man house." "I think it's splendid," admired Billy. "Lots more home-like than those other places of yours." "They were only night shelters, you might say," explained Stafford, "while this is the best attempt at an abiding place I am able to make down here." Billy pointed toward the window. "Aren't you afraid your light will be seen?" Stafford shook his head. "No one can see the light till they enter this cove, and of course, when they found the cove and my horses, they would investigate anyway. But it would be a weird thing if it were discovered. Even in the dark, you must have realized that we threaded our way through innumerable intersections of gorge." As he spoke, Stafford was busy poking among the cans in the little cupboard. "We'll have a good supper," he said casually. "Then, when that is over, I'll fix the bunk for you. I prefer sleeping in the open myself." "Even in a storm?" asked Billy. "A storm doesn't amount to anything under these big pines," he assured her. "There's needles piled around the base of these 3 trees that haven't been wet with rain in 100 years. Perhaps I shall take my bedding roll and tarp down to the gap so as to guard against any possible surprise." Billy, slim in the candlelight as a yellow willow, looked at Stafford with a contented face. Then, stepping up beside him, she looked into the tiny cupboard. "Let me fix supper," she begged. "I love to do it, and it is the one thing I can help about." As she fried the bacon, she turned to her companion. "What are you going to do now that you have all the map, Chad? Hunt up the treasure?" Stafford started. "How did you know that I had the rest of the map?" he demanded. Billy's eyes dropped. "You didn't stay with the horses then, like I said." "No," said Billy faintly. That is, I was afraid something might happen, and if it did, I wanted to be able to help you." "But you didn't have a gun." "No, but I had one of the iron pegs from the tent, and I'd have used it if I had needed to," said the girl fiercely. Stafford threw back his head and laughed, until the rattling of a cowbell on the cabin wall froze the sound at his lips. In one big bound, followed by a sweep of his arm, he dashed out both the candles, and the 2 were alone in the palpitating darkness. "Chad?" came a small frightened whisper. "What was it, Chad?" Stafford felt one of Billy's hands groping toward him. "I'm afraid," said Stafford soberly, "that our retreat is being entered. I had a wire strung across the gap, breast high. It runs along the trees and hooks to the bell that was just rung. It gives one time to do just what we're doing: blow out the light if it is night and prepare for a siege. I'm going to get a bucket of water now." Groping his way over to the bench, Stafford picked up the bucket, made his way outside, and went around the cabin to where a tiny spring made faint music above the pattering of the rain. Throwing out the water already in the bucket, he scooped up a brimming pail full from a small, moss-rimmed pool and returned to the cabin. Close to the door, he paused and stared into the blackness toward the gap. There was no speck of light, Neither was there any sound to indicate the nature of the intrusion. Thoughtfully, Stafford entered the building and closed and barred the door behind him. "Is it you, Chad?" asked Billy in a small, hushed voice. "It's me, Billy," Stafford reassured her. The girl laughed shakily. "Isn't it strange what a lot of difference a little light makes, Chad? This doesn't seem like the same place anymore. It feels now as if almost any horrible thing could creep out of the shadows." "We're all right, Billy, and we'll have," whispered Stafford. "There's only 2 or 3 places where light can shine through, and I'll hang skins over them. After that's done, and something's thrown in front of the door, we're all right on the light score. Then we'd better eat while things taste good." "It may be our best chance," Billy agreed doubtfully, adding, as the light flashed on again, "What do you think it was?" "I don't know," evaded Stafford. "It could be nothing more than a limb's falling across the wire. I'd go see, but to do that, I need a light, and if there is anyone outside, it would betray my whereabouts." "Don't think for a minute it was a limb," Billy stated definitely, "and either do I." The bell rang too long, just like it was being jerked, then jerked again hard. "It did," acknowledged Stafford. "Oh well, for that matter, it could have been a deer with a cougar after it. Struck the wire on the bound, you know." There was rank disdain in the tilt of Billy's nose as she looked at him. "Don't you think I know more about the habits of animals down here than that?" she asked. "All the deer are higher up than this now, and so are the cougars. And if there was a deer and a cougar, the cougar wouldn't be chasing the deer. All the cougars I've known anything about are too lazy or too smart to run foot races for their meals. They spring from a rock or a tree." "Likely you're right," agreed Stafford, thoroughly chagrined. "Let's just leave it that we don't know what's out there. Probably we'll be informed in a few minutes." "TF, it's Critchlow, we none," Billy retorted. "He's part savage, but he's smart. It would be like him to prowl around till morning, partly because of being afraid to attack in the night, and partly because he'd know the suspense would wear on our nerves." Stafford looked at his companion. "How old are you, anyhow, Billy?" he demanded. "Somehow, you seem to change every few minutes. One minute you're nothing but a kid, the next you talk like a woman." Billy's long lashes swept down, concealing her eyes. "I guess maybe I'm both," she said, "old and knowing trouble, and young and experienced where fun is concerned. But I hope it isn't Critchlow." "It couldn't very well be," said Stafford. "Remember, we left him exhausted. But he could have rested several hours and still got to this point with the other 2 men as soon as we have," replied Billy. "We're not so many miles from where you took me away from them, are we?" "No, we're not," said Stafford. "But how in the world do you keep track of such things?" "TJ don't know," answered the girl. "It just comes natural. Jangle, jangle, jangle." Again the room was filled with the strident ringing, and the 2 occupants turned startled faces toward the swaying bell. Then Stafford stepped upon the stool and tore it loose from the wire that moved it. "I ought to have done that sooner," he exclaimed, as he looked at his small companion. Billy's face was chalk white. "It is Critchlow," she whispered. "No one else in the world would think of torturing us this way. It's more like the carrying on of a crazy person. No one in their right senses would want to keep warning us this way. And still, I don't see how it was that they followed us here tonight. Well, all we can do is to wait for them to make the next move, or for daylight to come. You might just as well rest while I keep guard." The remainder of that night dragged interminably. Billy lay down on the bunk and pulled some blankets over her, but every time Stafford looked toward her, she was awake, scrutinizing him with wide, troubled eyes. At last he blew out the lights, and pulling the screen from in front of the tiny window, stood by it, peering into the wet gloom of the falling rain. When daylight at last impregnated the black with gray, and the dim outlines of trees and cliffs crept phantom-like out of the murk, Stafford looked eagerly for a sign of their nocturnal visitors. Soon he could see the horses browsing on the drenched grass. All were feeding quietly, and gave no sign of having been disturbed. As he watched, the clouds began to break, and through the rifts a stronger light poured into the cove. Now Stafford could see practically all over the glen, and a growing conviction welled in him that there were no other human beings besides themselves within it. Yet he hesitated a little longer, for the clamor of the cowbell still rang warningly in his brain. It might be that Billy was right, and that Critchlow was here, waiting perhaps with his companions just around the angle of the cabin for him to venture out and be shot or captured. Another thing that held Stafford back was the fact that Billy was asleep, and he hated to disturb her. Soon enough, at best, she would awaken to the grim realities of their desperate situation. So it was that Stafford delayed his reconnoitering expedition for almost another hour, and while he waited, the sun came out and began to toast the rain-steeped needles. A breeze blew into the vale and brought to his nostrils the odor of wet sage, red willow, and mint. Turning his head, Stafford glanced at the face of Billy, composed and sweet as she lay sleeping. A mountain wren gave voice to a fragment of song, and Stafford felt himself surrounded with so many evidences of the wonder of existence that life became doubly sweet. He must somehow not only get this girl out of her strange predicament, but also win his own way back to security and the respect of his fellow men. At last he could delay no longer, and touching the girl's shoulder, he gently woke her up. "PM going outside, Billy," he explained, in answer to her first sleepy bewilderment. "Shut the door after me, and don't open it till I return." Startled remembrance of all that was past leapt into the lovely violet eyes. "But what if Critchlow is out there waiting for you?" she exclaimed, one of her hands grasping at his sleeve to detain him. Stafford smiled. "I don't think there is anyone out there, Billy." "But the bell. Something else must have happened to it. That's one of the things I wanted to find out about. Be careful." Outside the cabin, Stafford edged cautiously to a corner and looked around, then instantly his air of caution vanished. A coyote was standing back of the building, 2 half-grown pups at her side. At sight of him, they whirled and vanished instantly. If there had been anyone else near the cabin, the animals would not have been there for him to see. The only way by which they could have entered the cove was by way of the gap, so it seemed proved conclusively that there were no men at it. Hurrying toward the narrows, Stafford found the pole gate still in place, while just beyond it was a churned spot where a horse had stood for apparently a long time. Mystified, Stafford crowded under the gate and found that the wire he had stretched across the gap was broken, and a piece of it gone. Moving on down the passage, Stafford paused. At the narrows, he saw the horse that Billy had been riding the night before. He was standing at an intersection of the 3 canyons and seemed to be tangled up in something. That something, without a doubt, was a piece of Stafford's wire. Relieved, he started toward the animal, then halted abruptly while a groan escaped his lips. Chapter 7. There were voices below. Someone was approaching, and they would find the horse. An instant later, 8 men came in sight, and at their head were Oliver and Sheriff Ross. Sick at heart, Stafford turned, and keeping out of sight, hurried back toward the cabin. If he had only gone out earlier, then he could have moved the horse back, and perhaps escaped discovery. Not one man in 1,000 would think of turning into the gutter leading to his hiding place. Stafford himself had passed it a dozen times before discovering it. But now these men, with the horse for a clue, would undoubtedly ferret it out. Below, he could hear shouts of triumph. In the eager voices of his enemies, it seemed to Stafford there was the same hunger that sounds in the baying of a hound pack when the scent grows warm, and the kill lies just ahead of them. Billy met him at the cabin door, with concern in her face. "What is it, Chad?" she asked. "They're coming, Billy." But not for all the world would he have told her that it was the horse which she had turned loose that had been their undoing. "What are we going to do?" she asked. "I guess it's not our move. We'll wait and see what Ross and Oliver have to say." There was not long to wait, for almost instantly the 8 riders broke into view and rode swiftly toward the cabin. When they were within 50 yards of the building, Stafford shoved a rifle through the window. "You're close enough, boys," he shouted. "If 1 or 2 of you want to move in closer to parley, all right. But the rest stay back." At his command, the posse halted, while Ross and Oliver flung themselves from their saddles and strode toward the door. "That will do," Stafford ordered, when the pair were within 30 feet of the window. "We can talk fine from here." The 2 halted, and Stafford could see the savage satisfaction on their faces. "Well, Stafford," called Ross, "it looks like we'd come to the end of the trail pretty fast. Tell me, do you feel as bold and wicked as you did last night?" Before Stafford could frame an answer, Oliver broke into the conversation. "Guess you won't mind if I take back the horses you stole, will you? Reckon now that you understand that I take real good care of my stuff." Stafford faked a yawn of indifference. "I'm done with them, Oliver. Kind of glad to have you come along and save me the trouble of tending them any longer. Anything else you'd like?" "Nothing at all," Ross put in, "except you and the girl." Stafford laughed. "You're easy satisfied. Wouldn't you like the treasure that map told about as well?" Instantly, a covetous gleam crept into Ross's and Oliver's eyes. "Have you found it?" they asked in a breath. "Do you think I'd tell you if I had?" laughed Stafford. Ross looked silly. "Of course you ain't found it," he exclaimed. "You never had a chance. It's just last night you stole the other half from us. But just supposing I have got directions for looking it up." "In a few minutes you won't have," said Oliver. "Listen," exclaimed Stafford, "if you men are ever lucky enough to capture me, you don't suppose I'll have the map ready to turn over to you, do you?" "You'll be glad to turn it over," stated the sheriff. "Don't you think it? I'll burn it before ever you get inside this cabin." "What are you driving at?" demanded Ross. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to take the map instead of me and the girl." "I would," said Oliver quickly. "I wouldn't," said Ross. "And more than that, you wouldn't unless you're a fool, Sam. What's to hinder them from having copied it? Or again, maybe Stafford knows from the lay of the country that the map isn't correct now that he's got the whole thing in his possession. Nope. The only thing we can do is to ask Stafford here to give himself up without any strings connected to the business, and be murdered in cold blood on the way in. The men who framed me, and the officers after me being the same people, I'll have to say no, thanks. He'll stay here." "Suit yourself," retorted Ross, "but I'd think you'd at least want to let the girl go. You don't want her shot, do you?" "T'll leave the decision to Billy," Stafford stated dryly, "but I hardly think she'll decide that being with you is any improvement over her present condition." "I'm not going outside," said Billy in a clear, firm voice. "There's your answer," said Stafford. "Guess that finishes the parley." "Have it your own way," replied Ross, "but you won't feel so frisky when this cabin is being torn down around your ears and there's rifle slugs eaten into every log." "The place is well built," said Stafford, "and if it ever gets in the condition you mention, there won't be near as many of you to see how it looks." "The trumps are all in our hands," smiled Ross. "We've got our choice of battering your door in and talking you by force or letting you choke to death. People don't live long in this climate without water, and I noticed the spring was outside." "We've got a water pail," replied the fugitive, "and it's full." "It won't last long," said Ross, "and we're in no particular hurry." "Maybe you're not," rasped Oliver, "but I am. I've got other things to do than spend the summer down here. I'm in favor of talking Stafford up on the map deal." Ross stared at the sheepman a long time before answering, and Stafford, watching them, felt that some sort of telepathic communication was going on between them. "All right, Sam," the sheriff said finally. "If you're set on it, we'll do as you wish. Hand over the map, and we'll leave you alone." Stafford smiled. "I'm not that simple, Ross. I'll give you the map, but it won't be till both Billy and I are safely back to civilization in a town that you don't control. You move out and give us a chance to leave unmolested, and inside of a week I'll see that the map's delivered to you in Rush. More than that, I believe it's authentic." It was Ross's turn to look amused. "You don't want much, Stafford. Some places you might make a pair of deuces win over 4 aces, but not with me. I'm going to have you dead or alive, and if the girl gets hurt in the process, why, that's your fault. Come on, Sam." There was an angry flush on Ochiltree's face as he turned to follow the sheriff. After they had gone a short distance, the sheepman's strident voice drifted back to Stafford. "You acted a fool about that act, Ness, Ross. You ought to have took him up. We could have got the map, and them too, that way. Wouldn't have been no trouble to have picked him up on the way out." Watching, Stafford saw the 2 men join the rest of the party, after which Oliver mounted his horse, and catching the saddle horse and pack animals which Stafford had used, rode away with the man Nick. Billy had found herself a place beside Stafford at the window, and together they watched the separation. "What does it mean?" asked Kemper. "Looks like they're through playing together." Billy frowned. "I believe they have quarreled," she said judiciously. "Didn't you see how Oliver was waving his arms just before he and Ross separated? I think from what Nick and Critchlow have said of Ochiltree that he's a sort of coward. Perhaps he's afraid that he'd be shot capturing this place. Probably feels like you'd try to get him, even if you didn't any of the others, after the way he's treated you." "At that, I'm not so sure he's wrong," mused Stafford. "Still, I don't believe he's leaving this part of the world. Oliver's been hit by this treasure bug too hard. Likely, he thinks he'll get Critchlow and the others, and maybe find the treasure while Ross is settling with us. I almost believe that's the answer. He's seen some place here the last day or so that looks as if it might be the region described in his half of the map. I've no doubt he's got every line of it in his head. Now, so long as Ross wouldn't bargain with us, he's decided to go it alone. More than likely, if he'd stayed with the sheriff, Ross would have wanted half what they found, if they got anything. Then again, he may only be intending to bring the others up here and all join in together against us." "I hope it's not that," said the girl. "There are too many out there now. So many, in fact, that 3 or 4 more wouldn't make any great difference," said Stafford. "I almost hope they are coming back here." "Why?" "Because that way we'll have only 1 bunch to keep away from, instead of 2, if we succeed in escaping. Also, I hate the idea of Oliver's getting the treasure maybe that the map tells about. You see," he added with a smile, "TM not downhearted enough yet to lose interest in it." "It looks as though the others were leaving too," exclaimed Billy a moment later. "See, they're going toward the head. That's probably to tie their horses where there won't be any danger of their getting shot," answered Stafford. "I suppose Jay ought to open up on them, but I hate to be the one to start this thing." 5 minutes later, the group of men who had last left reappeared, all on foot, and each carrying a rifle. As soon as they had entered the glen, they deployed to either side, 4 on the right and 2 on the left, seeking the shelter of the trees. For 15 minutes after this, neither the girl nor Stafford caught a glimpse of them. Their advance, if they were advancing, was being conducted with a stealth worthy of Indians. The pines, however, played out at a point not less than 75 yards from the cabin, and between them and the building was an open space where it would be impossible to advance without being seen. Stafford, with eyes glued on this line, was at last rewarded by seeing the trembling of a bunch of elderberry. Then, before he could see anyone, a shot rang out, and a lead slug tore splinters from the log above the window. It seemed the signal for attack, for after that first shot, bullets hummed from both sides of the glen. Both the small windows were shot through time and again, and Stafford saw that it would be impossible to use them in warding off an attack. "Keep low down back in the corner," he advised Billy. "That's right. On this side. Things are going to be considerably warm in here, but we're not whipped yet." As he talked, Stafford was digging the mud chinking from between two logs close to the floor. He finished the job just in time to see a man leave the pines and run for a short distance, then throw himself down behind a clump of sage. In an instant, he divined that this was to be the manner in which the attack was to be conducted. The 4 men had been sent to the right, because this was the only way in which any shelter at all could be found in approaching the cabin. Doubtless, the 2 men on the left would never attempt to leave the trees at all. Neither, perhaps, would one of those on the right. At least half of the force would be used to hold Stafford away from the windows. The sudden savageness of the attack seemed to indicate a determination on Ross's part to get the business over immediately. All this ran through Stafford's mind in a flash as he hurried with the work of enlarging his opening. Just as it was big enough to use as a porthole, another man dashed from the trees on the right and scuttled like a frightened cottontail for the shelter of one of the bunches of sage. This time, however, Stafford was ready, and as he caught the man's body over the sights of his weapon, he squeezed the trigger. The runner stopped short, swayed, then pitched headlong to the ground and lay still, one arm crumpled unnaturally beneath him. Instantly, Stafford was blinded by bits of bark as a bullet ripped through the opening he had made. It was but the first of many. Ross's gunmen were showing altogether too much proficiency. Wondering as to his next best move, Stafford looked about and saw Billy digging desperately at the chinking with a large knife. Already, she had another porthole ready for use, and was waving him to come to it. Stepping carefully over the hole he had just made, Stafford reached this last opening. Putting his eye to the aperture, he was in time to see a pair of legs vanishing into a heavy stand of mullein plants almost up to the house. The man's foot, however, still showed, and aiming carefully, Stafford put a bullet in it. The howl of pain that followed told more plainly than words that one more of Ross's men was going to have something besides fighting to take his attention. As he drew away from the hole to keep from being hit by the bullets that instantly began pouring through it, he found Billy at his side. "I don't believe any more of them have left the trees yet," she said. "Probably they won't then," he retorted. "There hasn't been anything lately to encourage them. But what will we do when they start again? We can't keep digging holes in here for long, or we'll sure be hit. Listen." Both stood still, almost without breathing, and to their ears came the sound of axe blows. "What are they doing?" Billy asked, her pupils dilated with excitement. "Starting to cut down a tree. That means they've had enough cross-country dashes and are going to try something else. They figure on felling that tree so they can use it for a breastwork while they're creeping closer. Ross is certainly in earnest about this business. What can we do?" "We can use the time they spend in cutting that tree to get out of here," said Stafford. "It's a big one, and they'll be busy for a long time." "How do you know it's big?" asked the girl. "Because a little one wouldn't reach out far enough," laughed Stafford. "They've got to have a whopper. Teal bet it's one of the tallest ones, just behind the chokecherry bushes. There'll be an hour or two felling it maybe, and during that time they'll call off the shooting. It's the break we've been needing, Billy." "I don't see what good it can do us," the girl demurred. "There's nowhere we can go." "Are you sure of that?" smiled Stafford. "Watch a minute, and I'll show you something." Stepping to the end of the cabin nearest them, he reached up and pulled aside a skin, revealing a small hinged door of slabs. Behind this aperture yawned a dark opening. Billy stared. "But how can that be possible? The cabin is standing in the open, nowhere near the cliff." "I know," replied Stafford, But there's a big tree against the end of it, and the tree is hollow. There's a good-sized hole in it, up about 60 feet. That hole comes out just above a large limb, nearly a foot in diameter. We've got to play squirrel and climb up this hole, Billy." "But we can't," protested the girl. "We'll slip back down." Stafford laughed. "I've fixed that, Billy. There's some big spikes driven on the inside. I did that over a year ago. We can walk right up it." "But why, if you knew you had this way of escape, didn't you use it sooner?" "Because it's a hard trail. I've been spending most of my time in past years swinging around on ledges, and I can negotiate it lots easier than you possibly could. It's nothing but an emergency exit, you know. And when we do get out above, we'll have a hard climb ahead of us, and no provisions. 2 canteens of water and a small bundle of food is all that we can hope to take." "They're not chopping anymore," exclaimed the girl. "Oh, Chad, do you think they're going to rush us?" Stafford's face grew grave. "I don't know, Billy. It don't seem like they would, after the dose they've just got. Teal, take a look." As he applied his eye to one of the cracks, a tremendous jar shook the cabin. Geysers of earth and stone shot up from behind the chokecherries, and the tallest of the yellow pines seemed to spring from the ground, its every branch and needle trembling convulsively. Fascinated, Stafford watched while the tree leaned toward the cabin, hung, almost as though poised, for a second, then came thundering down, with the air whistling and screaming through its boughs. When it struck the earth, the ground shook beneath the mighty impact, and the air was filled with flying splinters from broken limbs. Dynamite. The attackers had decided that the axe was too hard. Stafford shook himself loose from the hypnotic effect of the spectacle. Hurriedly, he grabbed up the 2 canteens from a nail on the wall, then handed one to Billy. Next, he passed her a small sack containing bacon, flour, and a few other camping necessities. As he worked, he watched through a crack beside the door for signs of Ross's men. He did not have long to wait before he glimpsed a hat bobbing along behind the fallen tree. Then another. They were not traveling fast. Evidently, the tangled limbs were proving an obstacle. Whipping out a revolver, Stafford aimed at one of the heads and fired. The felt hat leapt into the air, and the heads instantly disappeared. Stafford smiled grimly. This would hold them back for perhaps a moment longer. Snatching up 2 coats, he donned one and ordered Billy to slip into the other. From outside came shouts and a sound of running feet, then the crash of an axe against the door. "Hurry and get up that hole," Stafford whispered to the girl. "Climb as fast as you can, and when you get to the top, wait for me before you step out onto that limb. Understand?" Billy nodded. "But aren't you coming?" "In a second." "Hurry," he urged fiercely. Then, as Billy disappeared with coat and bundle, Stafford turned back and fired several shots through the door. "Go on. You're out of line." "He can't touch you," shouted Ross. "Keep at it, and we'll have him in another minute." And still Stafford tarried, intent on getting the articles that would be absolutely essential to their escape. One of these articles was a coil of rawhide rope. Then several boxes of shells were stuffed into his pockets, and finally he grabbed up a rifle from its pegs. This done, he ran back to the opening in the cabin wall and crawled through, pulling the hinged pieces of log shut after him. As the opening closed, he heard the rattle of a plank knocked from the door. Then feet thumped on the cabin floor, and the place was filled with a confusion of voices. Above the general uproar sounded the sheriff's cry of thwarted fury. "Where in Hades are they?" the officer was shouting. "They've got to be here. Look at the floor. See if there's a trapdoor there, anywhere." Stafford heard no more, for the walls of the great tree killed all the sounds as he climbed upward. He was about halfway up, when a block of light below showed that the door into the tree had been discovered. Now he could hear voices again. "Might have known the rat would have some hole," snarled Ross. All right, we'll smoke 'em out. Don't shove your heads in there, you men, unless you want 'em blowed off. Get some fine kindling and that can of grease. We'll have a smudge that would make a stone image shed tears." It seemed to Stafford that almost instantly flame spurted into the bottom of the tree. Flame, followed almost instantly by a puff of choking smoke, swept upward by the air current sucking through the tree. Chapter 8. Holding his breath, Stafford climbed the last part of the way with his head swirling. Then, at last, he was beside Billy at the upper opening, filling his lungs with fresh air. Directly beneath them, a horizontal limb ran out for 30 feet toward the cliff, ending in a blunt 6-inch stub some 6 feet from the bluff face. Almost on a level with the limb was a ledge some 2 feet wide. That ledge was their only chance for salvation. Below them was sufficient foliage to partially screen them from the eyes of those upon the ground, but it would be only a matter of minutes at most until Ross's men would discover the smoke pouring out and watch that point too closely for them to hope to go across unseen. Quickly, Stafford wormed through the opening and stood upon the limb. "Wait here just a second, Billy," he directed, and walked out 20 feet or more to where a smaller branch shot upward from the large one. To this smaller limb, he tied one end of his rope. Then he ran on out to the end of the gently swaying branch and jumped. His feet struck fairly upon the ledge, and the fingers of his free hand found a point of rock by which he could balance himself. Using this same piece of rock as an anchorage, Stafford snubbed the free end of his rope about it and beckoned Billy to follow him. Fearful, but unhesitating, Billy walked out to the very end of the limb, using the rope Stafford had stretched to balance herself. "Catch hold of the ropeway out," he ordered in a low voice. "Now lean toward me. Hurry. Don't mind if you do lose your balance. That's it. I've got you." Stafford's fingers had closed about her wrist like steel bands and whisked her across the gulf. As she stood trembling on the shelf beside him, shouts came from below, and bullets began glancing off the ledge about them. "There's not much danger," Stafford reassured her. "They're shooting blind. They don't see us. But we'll move on farther." Reaching out, he cut the rope in such a way as to save as much as possible, after which he turned and led the girl higher up the slope and around a jutting spur of rock into a narrow gutter which led upward. "Will they follow?" asked Billy excitedly. "I doubt it. It's a hard jump to make without a rope or anything to help. And I don't think Ross's men will try to come up this gutter. More likely they'll try to go round some other way and head us off." Shortly after this, the climb became almost perpendicular, with but the most indifferent of foot and handholds. At first, Stafford was uneasy every second for fear Billy would slip. Soon, however, he realized that she was almost as good on the climb as he was, and he devoted his entire energy to picking out the best and quickest route around the side of the cliff. He had never been on top of this particular mesa. In fact, he had not believed it possible to get there, although he had never tried with any seriousness to reach it. The reason for his indifference had been that he had studied its top from another mesa of the same height, and it had appeared treeless. Moreover, there was no cliff above it beneath which could be that old cliff dwelling of the map and his mirage. Now, however, Stafford saw something ahead which filled him with misgivings. His old, angling trail around the mountain was no longer available. High water from one of the last storms had produced a rock landslide in one of the nearly vertical gutters. This slide had completely sheared away the shelf of rock, which he had hoped would bring them into the comparative safety of a steep draw leading down into another canyon. When he stopped, Billy instantly divined the trouble. "We'll have to go up instead of sideways, won't we?" she asked. "Up or down one," he answered. "But we don't dare go down, and we can't go up. Makes a nice little problem, doesn't it?" "And we can't stay here forever," said the girl. "Still, as long as people have been above here before, I don't see why we can't get up." You can go anywhere anyone else can, Chad. What do you mean about other folks? Quizzed Stafford. I didn't know anyone had been up here at all, even this far, excepting myself. But someone has, declared the girl. I know it. Look what I picked up, wedged into a crack of the rocks a few minutes ago. In her hand was a fragment of red and black pottery. Stafford whistled. By George, it looks like you're right, Billy. That piece of stuff never blew uphill. But how in the name of time did it get here? I don't know, the girl answered, but perhaps this is the place your map told about. Why don't you get it out to sea? There's nothing here to see, objected Stafford, and besides, this couldn't be the place. There's no bluff up there for those cliff houses to be at the foot of, and there's no forest. Well, anyhow, let's look at the map, urged his companion. You haven't yet, you know, since you got the other piece. I'd like to see what the thing looks like altogether. Stafford glanced at the blank spot in the trail ahead and smiled. Reckon you're right, Billy. We've got as much time right now as we ever will have. There's no place to go. Sitting down beside a flat stone, he spread the two pieces of leather out and fitted them close together. No sooner had he done so than the rest of Bill Ryder's letter lay plain before them. Stafford read the completed message aloud. Here's the map of the place me and John Morgan found while trapping down here in '52. It will look fishy to anyone who sees it, but John and me know it's there. The drink's got a wallop, and knowing what's below it makes it all the better. Trouble is, you can't stay long enough to do much work. Something weird about the place, but the gold's all right. We got an idol almost to the top, and had it fall back. We're leaving now, but hope to come back and have another crack at it. Here it is in case we don't, but we want to be the ones to finish it ourselves. As he ended, Billy gave a little exclamation of wonder and pointed at a spot in the middle of the left-hand half. Look, Chad. That's the very place where your cabin sits. See. The cove, spring, and those three big trees are all outlined. Why, Chad, you've been living right on the trail and didn't know it. Stafford stared. It does look like the place, he admitted, but it can't be. As I told you before, that mesa up above doesn't answer the description. But there've been Indians up there, Billy insisted excitedly. The piece of pottery proves that. I wonder if they crawled up that hollow tree just like we did. Stafford shook his head. Hardly. The hole in the tree barely showed when I came here. I'm the discoverer of that means of getting up. Let's study this thing a little harder. What does that black spot mean? Asked Billy. See, the trail disappears at it for a teeny ways and then comes out at another one. Is that a cave of some kind? It might be, mused Stafford. There was a sort of hole back of the cabin. Stuff from the roof had fallen in and filled it up. I never bothered with it. Of course not, said Billy. You never had this half of the map. If you had, you would have reached the treasure years ago. Curled up with her high-topped shoes underneath her, the girl looked more like an eager-eyed boy than ever, as with hat pushed to one side of her head she pored over the map. Chad, she cried, that cave was only meant to have gone a short distance. They were in the open again by the time they reached here. I wonder what those zigzag lines are meant to represent, mused Stafford. Suddenly, he whistled. By George, I believe I've got it. Those are steps. We've got to look all along here for a place where there's some stone steps leading up that hill. As he spoke, he looked at Billy's bewildered face and laughed. I don't mean steps like a flight going up to a city or county building or a big church, he explained. These will be some small niches in the rock, just big enough for a person to cling to. Can you see anything like that? No, and it will be difficult to find them, won't it, Chad? Little niches like that would be awfully hard to see on the side of a big mountain like this. Maybe there isn't any use in looking for them. No use talking like that, said Stafford, resting his chin in his hands. The way we've got to figure is that we're going to find those steps. Let's see. The way this thing's marked, it looks as though the trail might run up one of those rock gullies. Where did you pick up that piece of pottery? Billy's brows contracted. Back about 100 yards. But that's not the place. It ought to be, argued Stafford. The logical place for broken pieces of pottery would be along their trail, if anywhere. Yes, but that little gutter where I found it had funny little plants growing all the way up it. There are no steps there. Show it to me. Hurriedly they retraced their steps, halting at last before a long, almost perpendicular gutter. See, said Billy, it has got vines growing in it. It has, answered Stafford solemnly, and PLL bet that there's steps under the vines. The only way they could have got started in such a place was by having good deep niches in which to root. Reaching a hand into the green foliage, he ran it exploring about. There you are, he ejaculated triumphantly, pulling the vines back so that Billy could see the first of a series of 6-inch deep, foot-wide steps. "T've seen lots of niches made near cliff dwellings," observed Billy, "but never any like these. They were all shallower, and not nearly so long that I saw." "I don't believe these were made by the Indians," replied Stafford. "They look to me as if steel tools had been used on them, something the Native Americans didn't have." "Then you think it was the two trappers who made them?" Stafford shook his head. "Not in the first place. They'd have mentioned it if they had. Also, it would have taken the two of them a year to have done it, and no trappers would spend that much time at this kind of work. You know, Billy, I'm beginning to think there's a right good mystery connected with this place, even if it isn't the one where the gold is located." "And the drinks," mused Billy. "Isn't it weird they mentioned the drinks? Water tastes mighty good down in this part of the country. Hurry now, and let's go on up. Some of Ross's bunch might accidentally take it into their heads to follow us, you know." Stafford led the way, and 15 minutes later they were at the top of the steps and out upon another ledge which led rapidly upward. Upon the rocks along their path were drawings, mostly in red, depicting hunting scenes, ceremonials, and wars. They were angular sketches, crudely done, yet endowed with a sort of savage vitality. In addition to the drawings, they came to piles of boulders, heaped up at some past time for purposes of defense. Some of these heaps of stone were placed upon rock platforms in such a way that the use of a wooden lever could send tons of them hurtling down the slope at once. Again, they clambered through narrow openings in rock walls built across the ledge. These walls had at one time served as defenses, for behind them were numberless arrowheads, broken spears, and bows. At each new evidence of something big above, Stafford and the girl hurried faster, and at last came out upon a smooth plain of naked stone. A cool wind blew across it and made them shiver. The air up here seemed to have an electric quality. One could almost imagine that it sparkled, and breathing it seemed like filling one's lungs with the elixir of adventure. Clouds on the west horizon seemed lighter and more ethereal than when viewed from the gorges. In fact, but few of the conditions of ordinary existence appeared to hold good upon this wild mountain. As he looked about, an exclamation of surprise escaped Stafford's lips. "This place is bigger than I supposed," he told Billy. "It looks fully 5 miles across and nearly as wide. I studied it through field glasses from points that must have been 10 miles away, but somehow I never got the right impression of its size. But what did people ever want to come here for? There are no trees, no water. None of the things that would make a place like this livable. All I can see is that some time or other, a bunch of hard-pressed Indians fled here to stand off the attack of some stronger tribe that threatened to annihilate them. TF, that's the case. How about the map? It's been all right so far." "The map," said Stafford, "is a fake, I'm beginning to think. Bill and his partner were a pair of jokers. They were up here all right, but they faked this forest, cliff-dwelling, and gold stunt just to give some other poor chaps a climb. I don't believe it, said Billy, but I'm too tired now to argue. And with that, she sat wearily down. Stafford glanced at the sun, well over in the western sky. No wonder you're worn out, he exclaimed. You're entitled to be. It's past 4 o'clock, and you've done all this climbing without a thing to eat. We'll break open our supplies and have a banquet. Wish I could give you something hot, but there's not a scrap of anything to make a fire with, and I wouldn't dare to use anything if I had it. What's the funny brown thing over to the north? Billy asked, after she had eaten. Stafford got to his feet and went toward the object indicated. As he drew closer, he stopped and stared in surprise, for the thing at which he looked was the stock of an ancient silver-studded blunderbuss with a piece of the old rest supporting its barrel still lying close beside it. Filled with wonder, Stafford returned and showed the articles to Billy. I'm not surprised at anything, the girl murmured drowsily. Till bet we'll find stranger things than that up here, Chad, but right now I've got to sleep. Stafford watched until her regular breathing told that she slept. Then he spread his coat down over her and walked briskly back and forth across the smooth, erosion-planed rock. The sun set, smoldering red in a sea of haze. The distant peaks turned from a bleak buff to twilight tapers, glowing with the day's last light, above lakes of indigo shadows before he stooped to awaken her. Bald as this mesa appeared to be, there might be some place that offered more shelter than the spot where they found themselves. At his call, Billy opened her eyes, stretched, then sat upright with a smile upon her lips. How are you feeling? Asked her companion. Wonderful, came the quick reply. Chad, I feel just as if we were in some sort of fairyland up here. And you're not worried about anything? He asked curiously. Not anymore, she said simply. I just feel that everything is going to come out all right. When I was little, I used to have lots of fairy tales to read. Chad, this is just like a fairy tale. I wouldn't be surprised, even if we find an ogre's castle up here. But what if we do? Everything always turns out right in fairy tales. And you know, I've had a rather hard 10 days trying to keep away from Critchlow. I could hardly sleep at all nights for thinking what he would do if he got me. That is partly what makes me so tired. After that, the two walked in silence for a time, with fitful gusts of wind dashing cold against their faces or rasping around tiny points of stone like the running feet of phantoms. One by one, the stars leapt out against the black bowl of night, while elfin whisperings seemed to fill the air. Over in the east, a silver glory grew in splendor, as the moon swung upward, until the nearer crags on the neighboring mesa were etched in palpitating frost. Soon the flood of light was all about the two, filling them with a sort of heady exhilaration, blended of mystery, romance, and their aloofness from the rest of the world. Nothing seemed real. Even their own danger dwindled to relative unimportance, as the rare wine of adventure coursed through their veins. It was the scream of a cougar which brought them out of the trance in which they moved. The cry was loud, and seemed to come almost from beneath their feet. Startled, they looked at one another. Then, as the cry was repeated, they stared ahead to where a gash was appearing in the plain. Chapter 9. Filled with excitement, they joined hands and ran toward it, eager for a glimpse of what was ahead. The spectacle came sooner than they expected, for before they had gone any distance, they were brought up short by the opening of a great chasm at their very feet. As nearly as they could tell, they were standing on its very rim. It was perhaps 500 feet in depth, and well over a mile in width. Moreover, this depression was heavily timbered on the side closest to them, and seemed to run almost entirely across the mesa. Notched, marveled Stafford, and I never dreamed it. From the places where I looked on the other mesa, this notch never showed. Look, Chad, called Billy. See over against the cliff on the far side. Stafford followed her pointing finger, and beheld the white, indistinct outlines of buildings, crouched at the head of a long, tailless slope running down from the bluff. But stranger yet were the long, dark rows of something undefinable running with geometrical regularity along the slope to the left of these buildings. "What is it?" asked the girl. "TF, you mean those rows? I don't know," replied Stafford, "but this is surely the place those two trappers had in mind. Look. You can count 2 or 3 little lakes dotted here and there among the trees. I'll bet this is an animal's paradise. Listen, and you can hear the big game thrashing around in the brush." Standing with bated breath, they heard the snap of limbs, the barking of a fox, and farther repetitions of the cougar's cry. One of the lakes was almost directly beneath them, and while they stood there, a doe and her fawn stepped out into the silver opening and stood with their wild grace silhouetted in black against the silver sheet of water. "We've got to get down there," announced Stafford, "but how?" "Look at the map again," urged Billy. "Wasn't there something about a signal fire on it?" "Seems to me there was," muttered Stafford, "and if there was, it would be up on top, I suppose. Here's the map." Spreading the leather out again, they examined it by the light of Stafford's electric torch. "Here it is," exclaimed Billy as one of her small fingers came to rest upon the spot. "See, it says place of signal fire right on the edge of this gorge. Only it looks farther to the west, and the trail starts down a little beyond it." "We'll go that way and see," said Stafford. A half hour of skirting the canyon brink brought them to a spot where there was a jumbling of good-sized boulders strewn upon the bedrock. Toward the center of this area, they found where stones had been built up into a crude circle some 5 feet high. Climbing up on the edge of this wall, Stafford flashed his light inside. It was partially filled with ashes. At its edge lay several partly burned sections of log, protected from decay by their coating of charcoal. "This is the place, Billy," he announced. "There's been fires here in the past, plenty of them. I can imagine a blaze going here night and day for a century, with poor wretches from that cliff house down below, carrying the wood for it up on their backs. Why did they have it? Ask me something easier. Maybe it was for worship. Maybe for signaling to guards stationed at the edge of the mesa. Who knows? Anyhow, it's here, and the road down can't be far away." Another few minutes' search brought them to a pair of large stones standing upright on the very edge of the precipice. Between these, a narrow trail crept down a steeply angling shelf of rock and disappeared into the depths. Without hesitation, Stafford and the girl started down this path. Soon there was the smell of pine in their nostrils, while the music of rustling leaves reached them, but little later. At a bush along the path, Stafford halted, and the flashlight revealed that it was full of purple berries, sweet-smelling and ripe. "Service berries. Let's eat a few." After this, they moved on down into the timber, where their path was arched with green until it resembled a tunnel. Leaves and needles heaped high on the floor of this path made it seem that they were walking on a deep-piled carpet. From the pines came the drowsy whit-whit of pine hens disturbed in their slumber by the passage of light. Rabbits repeatedly ran across their path, blinking in the glow till Stafford was almost upon them. 2 he killed with rocks. They would make a delicious breakfast, and he could procure them without announcing his presence to any possible listeners by the use of a gun. Repeatedly, he heard large animals lumbering through the brush close at hand. A big grizzly stepped into the light and raised himself on his hind legs as though to dispute their passage, but when the light of the torch struck him in the face, he gave a disbelieving woof, and dropping to all fours, lumbered into the forest. Twice cats appeared in the path and stood with backs arched at their approach. Then, when close, the animals emitted hissing squalls, and springing into the air, disappeared wraith-like into the shades. On straight south through the woods they moved until bare rock barred the advance of the conifers, and they were in the open, with the moon-bathed southern cliff in plain view. Nor had they strayed from the ancient path, for full ahead, with small windows staring blankly like the eye sockets in a row of skulls, were the cliff houses beneath the bluff. Also, They could see plainly those regular rows along the talus slope. Only now they were close enough to perceive that it was a growth of some kind. As they moved up the slope toward them, they felt the warmth of the past day beneath their feet. Stafford paused and sniffed. There was a sweet, heavy fragrance in the air, almost like a drug, it was so strong. "Billy," said Stafford, "we ought to know what that smell is." Why, it's grapes," breathed the girl. "Grapes getting ripe and falling on the ground where the sun has been cooking out their juice. Think of it. Grapes in a place like this." Pushing forward, they made their way to the vines and found themselves lost in awe as they contemplated their stupendous proportions. Some of them were bigger than a man's waist at their butts, and supported a pile of foliage and fruit, almost like a small haystack. Everywhere that Stafford turned his light, the rocks about the plants were stained with juice, while from the vines hung tons of purple fruit. "Someone with a head planted this patch," said Stafford. "Look, Billy, how flat rocks have been laid between all the plants to keep down other vegetation. Beats hoeing and weeding, doesn't it? And they did a job that's lasted fairly well, for perhaps hundreds of years." "It must have taken a long time for plants like this to grow," said Billy. "Makes one feel as though the place is still inhabited, doesn't it, Chad?" "It does," answered Stafford. "Suppose we go over to the cliff dwellings and look about. Perhaps there are accommodations over there for travelers. Who knows?" Leaving the grapes, they wandered through the moonlight toward the buildings. Most of them, as they drew closer, proved to be in a partial state of disintegration, but over to one side of the others, and with a stairway of stone slabs leading up to it, was a rock house in a perfect state of preservation. Even the roof of this building was intact, and the two explorers climbed the steps leading up to it, filled with an ever-increasing wonder. There was a huge, nail-studded slab door to bar their entry, a door with massive hinges of hand-wrought iron. It had been locked at some time past by a tremendous padlock which now dangled from a rusty chain. The present means of keeping the door shut was a heavy-bladed dagger that had been driven into the joint between two rocks. The chain had been wrapped around this dagger hilt. "Looks like maybe our friends, the trappers, had been the last callers," said Stafford. "But what are hinges, chains, and nails doing in a place like this?" A sort of excited shiver shook the girl, and there was a tremulous note to her laughter as she asked, "Shall we knock, Chad?" "I guess we can go in without it," he answered. Undoing the rattling chain, he pushed upon the heavy door. A shrill squawk of age-rusted hinges followed, then the electric torch revealed the door swung open, and a gust of cold, dank air rushed out. Neither Stafford nor his companion were prepared for what the beam of the light revealed. They had stepped into an old world, the world of Coronado de Soto and the other Spanish explorers. Rugs, moth-eaten and dim, were upon the floor. Ruffled shirts and velvet doublets hung from pegs beside pieces of tarnished armor. Cumbersome matchlock guns rested upon pegs above the fireplace, where a black iron kettle still swung above dead ashes. 3 or 4 pieces of silver service sat upon a mantel-shelf beside an hourglass. Upon a crude writing desk were piled some heavy brass-bound books, with several rolls of yellow parchment lying beside them. Stafford glanced at the rolls and saw that one of them contained writing, evidently done with the quill pen lying above them. "It's Spanish, of course," he said, "and I can't read it." "Let me," exclaimed Billy. "I learned it from a Spanish woman that used to stay with my mother a lot. I can read it quite well, only that this is so old and a little different." Stafford handed her the sheet and held the light so that she could see. After some minutes of study, she read slowly. "Having grown weary of our protracted exile from the land of our nativity, I, Don Jose Sarova, and my friend and partner in this most profitable business, Ferdinand Gomez, have decided to abandon our holdings and leave for Spain, taking with us sufficient wealth to make us influential all the remainder of our lives. Being, well, content with the treasure we are carrying away, and feeling that we shall never return to this lonely land, We willingly bequeath the remainder of the gold and the business that goes with it to the next adventurer of our race who comes here. The natives of this region have acquired a strong appetite for wine and a keen appreciation of its quality. Make your wine carefully after the rule that we have set down, and the heathens of these barrens will gladly barter anything they possess for it. Rule them as we have with an iron hand, and make them understand that ye are gods. Let none of the natives employed in your service drink except sparingly. This is a caution ye who would next trade wine for gold cannot afford to overlook, for disregarding it will bring danger. Keep your armor ready, your swords sharp, and if there be any danger of running out of powder, leave at once. Signed, Don Jose Sarova and Ferdinand Gomez. On the 12th day of March, 1678. We pray the saints may guard us on our trip out. As Billy finished, Stafford whistled. Grapes for gold. What an enterprising bunch those old Spaniards were, Billy. I tell you, they were real businessmen. Doesn't it say where the gold is cached? No, it doesn't. After she had spoken, the girl thoughtfully turned the roll over. Both she and Stafford gave a start, as they saw that it contained writing in crude English. "It's Bill Ryder again," exclaimed Stafford. Avidly, they read. "John, when ye get back here, be mighty careful how ye act. The savages is plumb hostile. I've explored all along the east end of the valley, and there's no going down that way. The Redskins is on the lookout. I saw where Sarova and Gomez got butchered, along with the rest of their bunch. Guess the Redskins took the gold. Anyhow, there wasn't none by them. If ye go out to prospect the south rim, before I get in from the west, leave word when you're coming back. Also, I'd like ye to leave that spare powder horn of yours. Mine leaks." For some time, after he finished reading the message, Stafford was silent. He was busy, trying to visualize those long-gone days of excitement. One thing he well knew: Bill Ryder and his partner had got out of this particular scrape, and had lived to quarrel. "He'd like to have known this Bill Ryder and John Morgan," he said aloud at last. "They must have been real men." Billy failed to answer, and Stafford turned to find her eyes almost shut. "Billy," he exclaimed, "you're going to sleep again. You must be almost done out." The girl nodded drowsily. "I think I am, Chad. I'm still tired, and Spaniards or gold or anything doesn't seem to stop me when I get this way. I'm going to curl up on Jose Sarova's bed and sleep for hours and hours." After Billy had gone to sleep with his coat thrown over her, Stafford stepped out into the moonlight. He had been in the open but a moment when a shot reached his ears. It seemed to come from a point, perhaps 2 miles from the east. Instantly it flashed through his mind that this would be from Oliver's party. The reason that the sheepman had left so promptly the past morning was that he had recognized the spot where Stafford had his cabin as the one described in his part of the map. Doubtless he or his men had found out about another path which they thought would lead up to the plateau. Evidently their belief had been justified, for certainly the report he had just heard was within the gorge where Stafford knew stood. He was not particularly surprised that another man had found a way up onto the mesa where he himself could not. This was far too big and rough a country for any one man to discover all the points about it. Besides, Stafford had not tried particularly hard, believing that it was not the place for which he sought. So now, just as he and Billy had reached the goal, the sheepman was at hand, ready to wrest from them the fruits of victory, perhaps even their lives. The first point to be considered was how to keep Billy from falling into the hands of Oliver and his henchman, Critchlow. The best thing to do would be for them to start back the way they had come, as soon as the girl was rested enough to travel again. As he mulled over this matter in his mind, Stafford's glance roved toward the rim of rock which they had skirted when trying to find the path down. To his amazed chagrin, there was a light shining on that rim, shining at the spot where the old signal fires had burned in the long dead past. That could mean but one thing. Ross had finally dared to follow, and was camped there waiting for a new day to move forward. So both possible avenues of escape were blocked. To attempt to pass so close to that fire on so brilliantly lighted a night would be folly. If there were any chance for leaving at all, it would be by getting past Oliver's band. Instantly, Stafford decided to move in that direction and reconnoiter. There would be ample time for him to come back and get Billy, provided there was a road open for their escape. Chapter 10. Half an hour later, Stafford was approaching the sheepman's camp. It was situated close to the east end of the false valley, and at a point where the gorge narrowed to not more than 10 rods in width. There was deep grass in the bottom of the narrows, for this was no stream bed. On the contrary, the ground was rising somewhat. Not a tree grew on either side of the meadow, and the moon made it almost as light as day. On the side of this meadow next to him, Stafford could see the winking coals of a camp fire, while about it were lying the cocoon-like forms of the blanket-rolled sleepers. To pass this group without a fight would be impossible, and a fight with the odds 5 to 1 would be suicide. Thinking thus, Stafford squatted down in the shadow of a box elder bush and concentrated his mind upon the problem confronting him. In the morning, if nothing were done, Oliver and Ross would both move their forces into the basin. In time, they would get in contact with one another. Also, in time, they would discover the grapevines, the Spanish house, and even himself and Billy. After that, no matter what their private grudge at one another, they would join forces to cope with him. The outlook seemed very black. Had it not been for Billy, he might have been tempted to try shooting his way out, but that could not be. At last he rose, and retreated to a point farther back in the trees. Here, he pulled a little memorandum book and a pencil from his pocket. Turning on his flashlight, he printed the following upon a page. Oliver, you thought you had outsmarted me when you left me this morning, but it takes a better man than you to do it. I've got Stafford, the girl, the map, and the gold all in my possession, and there's plenty of gold. What do you think of that? If you're not satisfied, come on up to where I'm camped on the rim, and I'll give you a feed of lead. I'm not signing this, but you know well enough who is writing it. This done, Stafford shut off the light and crept cautiously back toward Oliver's camp. A cougar could scarcely have moved more silently or less obtrusively through the night than he. Soon he was close enough to hear the sound of snoring. Lifting his head, for he was lying flat, he studied the sleepers at close range. In all probability, he could move up to them without the guards suspecting, for the sleepers were in the shadow of a pine. Satisfied, he resumed his forward inching, and was soon close enough to reach out and touch the nearest sleeper. Lifting himself on an elbow, he strained to see the fellow's features. It was Critchlow, his face working as he dreamed. Carefully, Stafford edged around him and moved toward the next. This time, luck was with him, and he found himself looking into the sheepman's face, which was cool and calculating even in slumber. Oliver's hat lay near his head, while the butt of one of his guns projected from beneath the coat he was using for a pillow. Stafford turned his attention to the gun. Everyone knew the silver-ornamented revolvers that Oliver had carried for years. They were more characteristic of the man than even his shoes or his hat, and accordingly Stafford, with infinite patience, began the work of removing the gun from beneath the sleeper's head. It was slow work, for the least quick movement would spell disaster. Yet he kept on, and at last had the satisfaction of holding it unobstructed in his own grasp. Next, with the same forced deliberation, he took out the note and prepared to place it somewhere on the sheepman. As he paused to consider where might be the best place to put it so that it would undoubtedly be observed, Oliver made a spasmodic movement in his sleep and kicked out, striking Stafford. Instantly, his snoring ceased, and with a prickling of excitement, Stafford realized that the man was returning, partly at least, to consciousness. It was too late to run without being detected, and that would entail a night pursuit, the last thing that Stafford wanted. For one brief moment, his mind revolved a dozen possibilities at lightning speed, then hit upon the one which seemed the only course to take. Instead of trying to move away, he lay upon his side, in an attitude of slumber with his face turned away from Oliver. After that, as a final touch, he ventured a faint snore. "Get over Critchlow, can't you?" mumbled the sheepman a second later, his voice thick with sleep. As the sheepman spoke, one of his arms pushed his companion. In answer, Stafford emitted an unintelligible grunt and moved away. A few half-satisfied, half-grumbling sounds escaped Oliver, and then again his snoring sounded peacefully through the camp. Raising up again, Stafford felt about till he found the sheepman's boots and tucked the note into one of the leather grips on the tops. Satisfied, at last, he wormed his way out of the camp with half his night's work done. After stopping to make sure that Billy was all right, he started toward the twin rocks that guarded the upper end of the path down into the gorge. And an hour and a half after he left Oliver, he was not more than a stone's throw from Ross's camp. Again, he took out his memorandum book, this time in the shelter of a big rock, and printed a second letter which read as follows. "Ross, you're a skunk, and I'm going to tell the world you are. I've got the girl. I've got the gold, and I've got Stafford. I've made peace with Stafford, and I'm going to take them all back out with me and spread the news of what kind of a sheriff you are. Once or twice you've hinted that I was yellow. If you still think so, just try and take one of the things I mentioned away from me. I'm camped at the east end of the valley. If you do come, you want to have your irons ready to smoke. You know who this is." Stafford looked at his completed work with satisfaction. Next was the job of getting it to Ross. It was still bright moonlight, and Stafford doubted his ability to reach the fire unseen. The chances involved were tremendous, as there was not a thing until he reached the ring of rocks to obscure his movements. While debating, he moved upward toward the twin rocks. When close, a small stone rattled down between them. Instantly, Stafford froze in his tracks. A moment more, and he heard a weary grunt, followed by a scratching sound. After this came the faint flare of a match, and then the aroma of burning tobacco. He waited for some time, thinking that the guard might come into view. Nothing happened, however, and Stafford decided that the man was seated, probably with his back resting against one of the stones. After that came the tediously slow job of trying to stalk the guard. Inch by inch, Stafford moved upward, testing each footing with a caution that allowed no mistakes. Every step must be safe from the noise of snapping twig or sliding stone. There could be no grate of gravel, nor rasp of cloth against rock. At the start, he removed his shoes, and as he got close to the rocks, he took off his socks as well, so that he might avail himself that much more fully of the touch sense. Now he was between the rocks, with fumes from the guard's cigarette strong in his nostrils. Another 5 feet, ere he would be where he could see him. This last short distance, however, was made doubly difficult by the number of small rocks which cluttered the incline. To move without their rolling seemed impossible. Again Stafford paused to consider, and while he did so, the guard cast away his cigarette, and the live end lay winking on the rocks above. Stafford stared at it, and as the guard shifted his position, he reached for his own revolver. He was going to be discovered. No, the man had settled down again and had lit a second smoke. Whereupon Stafford breathed more easily and fell to studying the rocks once more. To one side, there was a shelf some 2 feet wide and about the same length. It occurred to Stafford that he might pile those pebbles which threatened to reveal his presence upon this shelf. Accordingly, he set to work, and within a short time had stacked the loose fragments where there was no chance of their sliding. Again, he moved ahead. He could hear the man's breathing. Another foot. No, a half foot or less. Softly, he slipped Oliver's gun from his pocket, and, clubbing it, pulled himself upward until he was crouched at the very angle of the monolith. Now was the moment of decision. Quickly he thrust his head around and found himself staring into the face of the guard, not a foot away. The man's hat was off, and the moonlight beat full upon his features. Stafford saw his eyes protrude, then his mouth sagged and the cigarette dropped upon his leg. For the instant, he was paralyzed by the suddenness of Stafford's appearance, yet the latter could see that he was struggling to regain control of his voice. Stafford's gun arm swung upward, and there was a flash of bright steel in the moonlight. Then the guard's head sagged downward and a low moan escaped him. Satisfied as to the guard's unconsciousness, Stafford fell to work. Cutting loose the man's suspenders, he used them to tie his hands. His gun belt he used in a similar manner to strap the legs. This done, he gagged him, and afterward took the letter from his pocket and pinned it with a thorn to the guard's shirt front. Just before leaving, he dropped Oliver's revolver upon the ground. Chapter 11. As Stafford approached the grape patch once more, he heard Billy's voice crying his name. Hurrying forward, he met her beside one of the great vines. "Oh, Chad," the girl called, her voice filled with great relief. "Chad, I dreamed that you had left me. It was terrible. I woke up, and then, when I found you gone, I couldn't control my nerves. I've imagined everything. And this vineyard, it's peopled with ghosts, I think. I've been up and down the rows looking for you, and the rustling and whispering of the vines is like the sound of voices. They laughed and jibed at me. They said that you and I would become old and be ghosts like they are. I hate those vines. Let's leave." Stafford laughed reassuringly. "It's getting daylight now, Billy. Ghosts never bother in daylight. We don't want to leave till we know more about this place. Besides, I don't know where else to go just at present. See, there's someone camped on the mesa above. We can't go that way." Billy stared toward the spot of red. "Who is it, Chad?" "Ross." "You've been up there, then?" "Yes." "What for?" "Just a scouting trip," he assured her lightly. "Now, I'm going to cook you a rabbit before it gets light enough for them to see the smoke. Let's find a place by the cliff houses. I'd rather be in the open. I don't care where we do it, now that you are here. Chad, can't we find another place out of this? Over east, perhaps?" "Not now," said Stafford. "Oliver is coming up that way." A sound of dismay escaped the girl's lips, and Stafford hastened to comfort her. "Don't let that bother you, Billy. No doubt we're better off with 2 bunches after us than 1. That couldn't be possible." "Anything's possible in a place like this. Come on. We'll get our baggage and hunt a place to cook breakfast. Maybe we'll find some wine stored around here somewhere. Looks reasonable that the Spaniards had a supply, you know, and Ryder mentions the drinks." "I don't like the stuff," said Billy firmly, "but it would be fun to hunt it, though I don't see how they could get barrels into a place like this. How about using native crockery to store it in?" joked Stafford, eager to keep any conversation going that would keep his small companion from worrying. "There's an idea, Billy. I'll bet there was a lot of competition here in the old days, seeing which of the natives could make the biggest jars. Come on. Let's find them. It ought to make a worthwhile exhibit." Joking, he led her out of the grapes and toward the old Spaniard's house where they gathered their scant belongings together, then hurried toward the row of deserted dwellings. Behind them, there was a shallow cave, and the two walked through it with the dust of bygone days deep about their ankles. Yet nothing of interest was revealed, and they returned to the outside, making their way down into a little hollow with pines growing in a part of it. It was a striking place, different from anything Stafford had ever seen. The trees were large and far spaced at the upper end, while farther down they grew smaller, finally disappearing entirely. Nor was there any other living vegetation where the trees were absent. Nothing remained in the area but rock, bare earth, and the yellow piles of decay, marking where trees had once stood. There was plenty close at hand, however, to occupy their attention, for beneath the trees were the round, juice-stained rocks that had been used to weight the grapes down in the old wine presses, all of which had rotted badly. Yet enough remained for Stafford and his companion to picture something of the strange bustle of that old-time vinery. The path of rocks leading from the presses out to the vines still invited traffic, while a similar path led over a little rise of ground to a spring, beside which were the broken fragments of numerous earthen jars used for transporting water. In fact, all along the trails were pieces of broken pottery, speaking more eloquently than words of the feet that had passed to and fro. Of the vats, there was little left but broken slabs, staves, and fragments of split and twisted willow, which in some sheltered spots had escaped the rains and so had failed to decay. Pieces of their old willow hoops, explained Stafford in answer to Billy's questioning. Doubtless, they had them pretty well covered with them. It would take a lot of vats this size. It looks as though the Spaniards had done a lot of export business here. Probably furnished liquid happiness to Indians over quite a tract of country. But I don't see where it was stored, said Billy, and I don't understand why there are no trees down at the other end of this hollow. Maybe if we'd go down there, we'd know the answer to both things, suggested Stafford. Shall we go? Before they had taken a dozen steps, their eyes were attracted to a round, stone slab lying upon the floor of the glen, at a point where there was nothing but naked rock around it, except for a ring of loose dried clay close to the stone slab. Beyond this point, only a few feet, was a cliff of white rock with a hole in it some 6 feet or more from the ground. Stafford took hold of the slab and lifted, but he could barely make it move. "No use, Billy," he said. "I'm not strong enough. Run back and get a piece of wood from around the old presses. Maybe we can pry the top off with a lever." While he waited, he sat down upon the edge of the slab to get his breath and meditate upon the reason for the clay around its edge. He concluded that perhaps it had been used in sealing the opening to whatever chamber was below. From this, he fell into a dreamy speculation upon the people who had toiled in this out-of-the-way place. Next, in a hazy sort of way, he realized that he was sleepy, more sleepy than he had ever been in his life. He had better get up while no use. He was sinking into a soft void of utter nothingness. Later, lights fizzed in his brain, and voices seemed to call from a great distance. He wanted to hear what the voices said, and tried to answer. The roaring in his head increased in intensity, until at last it brought him, on some sort of ghostly current, back to where there was light. And last, but more important than all else, he could see Billy's anxious face above his own. "Wake up, Chad," she was crying. "Please wake up. You must. You've got to." There were tears on her cheeks, and a broken piece of crockery in her hand, from which she poured water upon him. Slowly, Stafford regained fuller consciousness. What happened?" he asked at last. "When I got back with the stick, you were asleep, Chad. And though I knew you were tired, somehow your sleep didn't look just right to me. I was frightened, and suddenly began to hate the spot where you were. I hauled you back up here." "Billy," he exclaimed wonderingly, "how could you?" "I don't know," she retorted, "but I guess the sound of guns frightened me. Chad, there are people fighting over beyond us away. I guess it's Ross's and Oliver's men. There's been screaming and cursing to turn one's hair gray. Get up. Do get up. The sounds are coming closer." Dizzily, Stafford rose to his feet with Billy's help. Upright, the mist seemed to lift from his brain. "I can't understand it," he muttered, looking back at the stone slab on which he had fallen asleep. "It seemed as if I was hypnotized, or had an anesthetic or something of the sort. Anyhow, I couldn't get up when I knew I should. Guess those old Spaniards put a curse on the place, Billy." "Never mind what they did," panted the girl. "We've got to run. Hear that?" Stafford heard. It was the crash of repeating rifles close at hand. The reports dashed against the cliff front to the south and were echoed back in staccato peals. Billy was right. It was time to go, and Stafford, turning, ran heavily toward the cliff house with the girl at his side. Before he had gone any distance, he felt too tired to go farther. "I'm going to stop behind this rock," he said, pointing to a huge stone with chokecherries spraying over it. "They'll not find me here." "You'd better go farther, Billy." "I'm going to stay with you," girl retorted fiercely. And together they crouched down, peering through their screen of green fronds toward the point from which the firing came. As they watched, the sound swept closer until they caught a glimpse of two disheveled figures running beneath the pines down toward the stone slab on which Stafford had slept. One of them Stafford recognized as being Oliver, and Billy said his companion was Critchlow. Close behind them came Sheriff Ross and another man. "Don't shoot any more," Stafford heard Ross call to his companion. "They're out of ammunition. We'll get 'em alive." Below, Oliver and Critchlow saw that they were trapped and turned at bay like wild beasts. At the sight, Ross laughed mockingly. "Thought you could outsmart me. Well, you put up a harder scrap than I thought anybody as yellow as you ever would. But you're caught now, Sam, even if there was several good men shot in the process. Now, unless you want to go to the happy hunting ground yourself, you'll tell me what you did with the gold, the girl, and Stafford." Oliver showed his teeth like a cornered cat. "You're a great one to ask that," he sneered, "after getting 'em all yourself. Go on and get your killin' over with." Ross stared disbelievingly at the sheepman. "You've got the nerve to say that after leaving me that note." "I never left you no note," Oliver shouted. "You left one for me, you." He became incoherent with rage. Ross seemed to lose control of his temper, for suddenly his rifle whipped upward and flame spat from the barrel. Watching, Stafford saw a bit of felt fly from Oliver's hat brim, while Critchlow, who was standing just behind, pitched to the ground. "Missed the goose and hit the gander," snarled Ross. "Next shot you won't be so lucky, Sam." Oliver went white as he saw the fury in Ross's face. "Come on," the latter called to his companion. "We'll go down and reason with Sam some more." As the two hard-faced men strode toward him, Oliver seemed to shrink. When within about 20 feet of him, Ross halted. "Turn around, Sam, with your back to us," he ordered. Oliver hesitated, and a terrible laugh came from the sheriff, after which he called, "Sam, if you don't mind, I'm going to put a bullet through you and let you lie screamin' on them rocks." There was no doubting the decision that lay behind the statement, and the sheepman turned his back to the officer. "All right," snapped Ross to his companion. "Get busy, and tie his arms and legs." Ross's man moved swiftly, and in almost no time Oliver was trussed. "Now," directed Ross, "pick up that slab of wood and run it through his arms. That's it. Know what we're going to do to you, Sam? I'll tell you. We're going to twist on this stick till you cry for mercy, unless you tell what you did with them things." Oliver turned a face that writhed with fear toward his captor. "I can't tell, you cuss," he squalled. "You've got him yourself." As he spoke, the sheepman managed to jerk loose and run totteringly toward the white stone cliff that barred the other end. Here, with his head almost against the hole that Stafford had noticed earlier, Oliver pitched to the ground. Ross stared at the man. "What's happened to him?" he called to his henchman. "Think he's having a stroke just to cheat us? Go, see if you can get him up." The man went to obey then. As he bent over Oliver, he staggered and went down like a log. Chapter 12. Stafford and the girl looked at one another. Then, without a word, they turned to view the drama going on below. Ross, with legs straddled and neck craned forward, was staring at the two fallen men. After a moment, he took a step forward, hesitated, and shouted the names of both men. There was no answer, and Ross, instead of going closer, whirled and ran back up the hollow toward the remains of the old wine press. Stafford turned to Billy. "Stay here," he ordered in an undertone, I've got to intercept that fellow. He's going for help." Jumping to his feet, Stafford hurried down the hill with a drawn revolver in his hand. Bushes screened him from the sheriff until he had reached the pines. There, on the old path leading toward the grapes, he met Ross running heavily, head down. "Halt!" Stafford commanded. At the order, Ross glanced up and saw Stafford for the first time. Whatever else the sheriff might be, he was no coward. Surprise showed in his features, but no fear. In one instant he was erect. The next he was pitching toward the ground, pulling a revolver from his holster as he fell. Before his shoulder struck the ground, the first gush of flame leapt from the weapon, and Stafford, who had sprung sidewise, heard the lead singing at his ear. His own weapon crashed in answer, and rock dust flew from one of the stones in the ancient trail. Almost instantly, 2 more shots came from Ross, but they went wild, and Stafford saw that the fall had destroyed the sheriff's usually fine coordination of hand and eye. Ross seemed to sense the fact at almost the same instant, but appeared amazed at Stafford's failure to continue shooting. The chagrin in his eyes at failing to score a hit turned to a grim satisfaction. "Your gun's jammed," he exulted, then leveled his weapon once more, this time with the utmost deliberation. Just as he was about to press the trigger, Stafford's gun spoke a second time. Ross's weapon flew from his hand, and he uttered a cry of pain. "Got you, Ross," Stafford remarked quietly. "I could have got you sooner, for that matter. Only I wanted to take you as nearly whole as possible. You'll make a better exhibit that way. Now stop your howling. I want to ask some questions." "What do you want to know?" "Where you were headed on the gallop, for one thing. I was going to see if any of my bunch was still able to travel. If there was, I was going to have them come back and give me a lift with my man and Oliver. Why didn't you do it yourself?" "I was afraid to. I can stand up to lead pretty fair, I reckon, but I ain't made right for fackin' the kind of thing that's down there." "What kind of thing's down there?" "I don't know. But you saw it get Oliver and that fellow that was with me, didn't you?" "Sure, I saw them keel over. And now, I'm going to watch you haul them away from there." The sheriff's face turned several shades paler. "I won't," he stated flatly. "Oh, yes you will. You wouldn't like to have me shoot you, the way you were planning to drill Oliver. Right about face. There's no time to lose." At the point of Stafford's gun, Ross marched back down the glen to a spot some 30 feet from where the two lay. "From here you go it alone," Stafford ordered. "My advice to you is that you work fast and hold your breath while you're closest to that hole. TD even advised standing stooped, so that your head's well below the opening." "It'll get me," said Ross shakily. "If it does, it isn't the hardest way to die," replied Stafford stonily. "Hurry. You can rest between trips. Don't pay any attention to Critchlow. He's dead." "So are the others," muttered Ross as he crept forward. 3 or 4 minutes later, the 2 men lay stretched at Stafford's feet. Ross was still upright, but he seemed dazed. "How do you feel?" asked Stafford. "Like I wanted to go to sleep," answered Ross drowsily. "I'm all in." Stafford reached out and slapped the officer in the face. The blow seemed to revive him. "Get back up the gully away," ordered Stafford. "Then, when your head clears a little, we'll drag these 2 on up to the shade of the trees." When at last the unconscious pair were lying side by side close to the old wine press, Billy joined Stafford. Ross stared. "How comes it that you 2 are loose?" he demanded. "Did you make some sort of bargain with Sam?" Stafford shook his head, then said to Billy, "Get some water so that we can bring these 2 around and dress the sheriff's hand." Shortly afterward, Ross received crude first-aid treatment and was securely bound. The other 2 were still unconscious. "Are they going to get over it?" asked Billy. "I think so," answered Stafford. "What was it that happened to them?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. You watch them, Billy, while I'm gone." If they stir, or you see anyone coming, call me. Oh, don't go, Chad. You'll be hurt. No danger. I've learned a lot from observation. But I'm going to take along a better pry for the stone slab. Hurrying back to the spot, Stafford found a small boulder to use as a fulcrum for his wooden lever. This time, when he lifted the rock, it moved and slid back a few inches. Instead of following up his advantage, Stafford moved away for some distance and stood a few minutes before returning to finish his task of shoving the stone aside. This time, the sunlight drove downward in a great yellow beam and illuminated a purple pool some 10 feet below. From the surface of this pool projected a hideous, dark-stained head. At first it seemed that of a human. Then, as his eyes got more accustomed to the gloom, Stafford realized that it was a carved one, an idol's probably. And most likely the one that Bill Ryder and his friend had fished for so many years ago. The stick, which Stafford had laid on the edge, somehow slipped and fell in. Purple spray flew upward, and to Stafford's nostrils crept the odor of old wine. This was the drink to which Ryder had referred. It would be like an old trapper to try anything. Suddenly, Stafford realized that he was getting sleepy, that it did not seem worthwhile to stir. He would not move. Just as he was slipping, a cry from Billy beat into his dulling consciousness. Billy wanted him, and Stafford's mind oddly responded to a call from her in a way that it would not have done for any other earthly agency. He jerked back from the edge of the pit, and rising to his feet, reeled toward the pines. By the time he had reached the girl, he could think straight. "What was it?" he asked as he saw her looking at him. "Men," she replied. "And anyhow, I was frightened for fear you were going to fall in. You acted so strangely." "I felt strange," Stafford laughed, "but I'm all right now. Guess it's time to tie these other two." In another 5 minutes, Oliver was able to sit up and stare about. The change in affairs seemed to bewilder him. "What's happened?" he demanded. "I don't get this. How comes it that Ross is tied, and that you, Stafford, and the girl are here?" "It means that you did a bum job of guarding them, and that they got loose," snarled Ross. "It's the thing that undid me. Just shows what a fool's luck will do." "I never had these people, you yellow liar," marveled Oliver. "What's the use of talking that way when you know, and I know, that I didn't?" "You two might as well quit bickering about that," interrupted Stafford. "Neither of you had us. We just slipped a fast one over, and you both fell for it. I left those notes." The men's faces were blank. "Thunder!" exclaimed the sheriff. "That makes it seem a lot different. We've both misjudged each other." "Well, there was no mistake about your killin' Critchlow and threatening to kill me by torture, was there, Jake?" snarled Oliver. "I'm through with you for good. As you are going to be tied together something like Siamese twins for the next few days while we're getting out of here, it would be better for you to try to cultivate a little affection for each other," advised Stafford. "What you aimin' to do?" asked Ross. "Turn you over to the authorities in another county," answered Stafford. "I know the prosecuting attorney in Rim County quite well. He'll be mighty glad to get hold of you when he knows what you've been doing." Ross and the sheepman digested this piece of news with wry faces. "Anyhow," said the sheriff, "I'd like to know what knocked Oliver and that other fellow over." "Gas," replied Stafford. "I don't know just what kind, but something on the order of monoxide gas, I suppose, escaping through a fissure in the rocks. It's the gas that killed the vegetation, and that would have killed you fellows if you had stayed in it a little longer. It's all over down there, but it's worse on a level with the hole it comes out of." "What's in the other hole, the one that had the lid on it?" asked Oliver. "Gold." "Wine and gold," answered Stafford. "They're mixed in about equal proportions, I should say." "It seems awfully weird," exclaimed Billy. "Why should they ever have poured wine in such a horrible place?" "It wasn't horrible then, According to my way of thinking, replied Stafford. You can see, there used to be vegetation down there. The decay from 1 or 2 trees is some of it still left. That shows that it can't be many hundred years since this flow of gas began. I think probably an earthquake made a fissure between 2 rock strata and permitted gas to come up, perhaps from way down deep. I figure that our 2 old Spaniard friends went out of business largely because of the earthquake and the gas. Probably they were a bit superstitious, as well as grasping, and thought that the hand of God was against them. But that didn't keep them from lugging such of the treasure as they were unable to take with them down to their wine cistern and dropping it in. That little message they left sounded mighty magnanimous, but there was a catch to it. Who does the gold belong to? Billy asked next. Stafford grinned. It belongs to you and me, Billy. We're partners in this. And I'm thinking your half will make you wealthy. Wealthy enough so you can go east if you want to, and get a lot of polish. Then marry some fellow that lives in a civilized country. I don't want to live anywhere but in the West, answered Billy. And you've promised to look after me. I will, smiled Stafford. But it's going to be some job, Billy, pretty as you'll look and all the nice clothes you're going to have. Pretty clothes, snarled Ross, looking like a trapped wild cat. Pretty clothes. Is that all you can think of for her to do with the money she'll have? What are you going to use yours for? Hair tonic? Stafford looked beatific. I like you, Ross, a lot better than I do Oliver. There's stiffening in your backbone. Just because I do feel that way, I'll tell you what I intend doing with part of mine. I'm going to use it to see that you fellows either hang or spend a good long time in jail. In fact, if it's a prison sentence you draw, I'll offer to pay your board and lodging if they'll keep you 2 in the same cell where you can enjoy each other for life. How does that strike you for being interested in your futures? Apparently, the prospect robbed them of speech, for neither Ross nor the sheepman uttered a sound. Stafford moved a short distance away, with the girl at his side. Billy, he said, don't you think this would be a nice place to fix up for a retreat when one gets tired of civilization? Billy flushed and turned her head away as she answered, I think it would be perfect for 2, Chad.